It's a typical lazy Sunday morning. You stumble out of the house feeling a little tired, sluggish, but desperate for something to eat. As you slowly wander down to your local shop, you look around and notice that the streets seem unusually empty for this time of day. No pedestrians, no traffic. Everything is eerily quiet. But then you notice something just out of the corner of your eye. A man standing across the street, slowly shuffling towards you. As he approaches you, you get a closer look at him. He seems pale, gaunt, almost diseased. His arms are stretched out in front of him. He's moving at a slow, shuffling pace, one leg dragging behind the other. And he's covered from head to toe in blood. You turn round and quickly begin walking in the other direction, but suddenly you see another figure also coming straight towards you, and then another, and then another. Suddenly you find yourself surrounded in all directions by these things, all shuffling towards you, covered in blood and hungry for flesh. Much like the zombies themselves, zombie movies are everywhere. They seem to breed and multiply at incredible rates, and right now, it's almost impossible to avoid them. New zombie movies pop up in cinemas or on streaming services constantly. Zombie TV shows are taking over the airwaves. Even mass events like zombie walks are hugely popular around the world. But what is it that makes the zombie such a popular monster? Critiques of zombie movies often accuse them of lacking complexity, depth or range. But is this really the case? Is there more to zombie fiction than just blood, guts and viscera? Do they actually have what zombies desire the most? Over the next few months, we'll be looking at the evolution of this incredible and prolific subgenre, from the early origins of Caribbean voodoo folklore through to the birth of George Romero's American flesh-eating zombie.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
We'll also take a look at the zombie subgenre's connections to body horror as we examine the work of filmmaker David Cronenberg.
It tells me that even old flesh is erotic flesh.
We'll be looking at the way in which horror icons such as Tom Savini and Lucio Fulci brought a whole new level of schlock to the zombie in the late 70s and early 80s. And finally, how filmmakers such as Danny Boyle breathed new life to the zombie movie in a post-9/11 world. Join me as we begin our journey through the evolution of the zombie movie.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes.
Welcome to the evolution of horror and Happy New Year. My name is Mike and as ever I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across several weeks. And this week we will begin our journey, as that intro suggested, through the evolution of the zombie movie. That's where we're at for the next few months. We will be covering everything, no stone left unturned. But this week is going to work as a little introduction. We're not going to be covering any movies in sort of spoilery detail. We're just going to be introducing the subgenre as a whole, trying to figure out exactly what is a zombie, what makes a zombie movie, and what makes zombie movies so popular, so fun, and so scary. Before I introduce my guests and we get started, a couple of quick announcements to make. The first one is, very excitingly, we are now on Patreon. So for anyone who doesn't know, Patreon is a sort of paid for subscription service in which if you donate money, you're kind of awarded extra content, merchandise, that kind of thing. We've got lots of exciting stuff to offer people who donate a bit of money, including extra bonus content in which we will be reviewing new horror releases, streaming recommendations, we might be doing live film commentaries. We're going to hopefully start introducing some merchandise. I know a lot of people have been asking about out Evolution of Horror stickers, badges, that kind of thing. Anyone who is generous enough to donate a bit of money per month to the podcast will get access to all of these things. If you enjoyed some of the episodes that we brought you over the last few months since Folk Horror ended, that included coverage of film festivals, of new releases. We had a couple of interviews with filmmakers. That is the kind of content that from now on is going to be paid for content. So the last few months worked as a kind of trial for me in that way. So if you don't want to subscribe, if you can't afford to pay any money, that's absolutely fine. You will of course still get the usual Evolution of Horror subgenre seasons. So you will get all of the zombie seasons for free, available on iTunes and all other podcast platforms. But if you are able and kind enough to help us defray the costs of making this podcast a little bit and donate a few quid per month, you will get monthly bonus content and other rewards. And this week, the first piece of bonus podcast horror content will be an in-depth review of M. Night Shyamalan's Glass. I'm joined by Brad Hanson, and the two of us discuss the movie at depth. We also talk about M. Night Shyamalan's previous works, such as Unbreakable and Split, and figure out whether or not this is a top-tier Shyamalan, middle tier, or, you know, one of the shit ones. So if you want to check that out and be treated to lots more bonus content, then please do get involved. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. I will also list all of the details in the show notes. And one final little announcement is that we now also have a very swanky new website. So you can now go to www.evolutionofhorror.com, and that's where you can find everything. You can find all of the previous episodes, you can find all of the seasons, you can find interviews with filmmakers. It should be hopefully a nice, easy to navigate website in which you can find any content you might want. There's also some stunning artwork on that website, which I absolutely love, made by the brilliant Mike Lee Graham. He's a graphic artist and listener and friend of the pod, and he's done an incredible job in helping me with the website. So I want to say a big thank you to Mike. There is also a blog section on there. There's actually going to be some written reviews, pieces, features, that kind of thing. And I'm inviting anyone, any writers or bloggers who might be interested in contributing to the website and submitting written pieces, to just get in touch with me. If you want to write something, a review of a horror movie, a classic, a new release, just a general opinion piece on something, a filmmaker, a subgenre, anything you like, get in touch. Drop me an email, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and your pieces could be featured on the new website. So once more, that website is evolutionofhorror.com. But let's get started. We've got so much to discuss this week. Now, later on in this episode, I am going to be joined by two incredible guests, Freudian cinephile Mary Wilde and brand new guest Tim Coleman. And the three of us have a fascinating discussion about the zombie subgenre from both a psychoanalytic and also a kind of historical and sociological perspective. So all of that is to come. But first of all, an introduction to zombies. What is a zombie? What is a zombie movie? Joining me to chew this over is one of my favourite people. He's back on the podcast a third time. He was with me last series discussing Oni Barbar, and the series before that discussing ghost stories. From the BFI, Sight and Sound, and the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television, it is my great pleasure to welcome back Kevin Lyons. Kevin, hello.
Hello, nice to be back again.
Yeah, lovely to have you back. Now, we've got a lot of stuff to discuss today, because, oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah.
So, obviously, last we've talked about a few different things together. We talked about ghost stories. We talked about folk horror as well last year. Now we're on to zombies. We were just saying before we started recording, I've had trouble this year kind of narrowing down exactly how many zombie movies to cover, which ones to cover, because there are a lot, aren't there?
There are, and by the time we finish this, we'll talk for about an hour or so. By the time we finish this, there'll be 3 or 4 more. You know, they're breeding faster. They breed faster than The Walking Dead themselves. They're coming out all the time. I mean, literally every day I find a new one, you know.
It's amazing, isn't
it? It's staggering.
Now, what I want to ask people is, where do you think, let's say a zombie apocalypse happened, where would you go? Where would be your ideal place to kind of haul up and survive? What would be your strategic kind of way of surviving the zombie apocalypse?
To be fair, I'm 56. I'm overweight. I'm not very fit. To be honest, I don't think I'm going to survive more than 5 minutes. To be perfectly honest, I kind of miss the old days of the slow-moving zombies, because of the steady stroll. I could have outwalked those. These new fast-moving ones. I'm done for.
No, exactly.
I do live 5 floors up, so I think maybe I should just lock the door.
That's always good, isn't
I
it?
lock the
That's
door and
always
I'll just watch a load of really good zombie films to pick up some tips.
Exactly, exactly.
And if they can get up the stairs or make our lift work, then fine, that's cool.
I know. I actually thought maybe this building where we are now, the BFI South Bank, is quite a kind of concrete, it could be a bit of a fortress if
You can
need
get
be.
lost in here very
Yes.
easily. I don't think it would take much to confuse a zombie coming in
Exactly.
here. They'd be wandering around forever, wouldn't they?
Exactly. I think I often am in here anyway, yeah. So, tell me then, what's your... overall, are you a fan of the zombie subgenre?
Yeah, up to a point.
Yes.
There are some really, really good zombie films that I would count right in my top 20 films of all time.
Yes.
Like I said, there's an awful lot of rubbish out there as well.
Yes.
It seems to be that the zombie film is more afflicted with that than just about anything else.
Yes.
Well, that's my sort of feeling looking at it. That
Yes.
There are more sort of, couple of mates in a back garden with a video camera type zombie films than there are vampire films or ghost films or whatever.
Definitely.
And so wading through them, you do find some gems still. They still turn up.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be dispiriting from time to time when you see yet another zombie apocalypse done with CGI and you think, come on guys, let's move on.
Yes.
Then you see something like Train to Busan and you think, actually,
there's still life.
there's mileage.
Yeah.
We can make this work. So every so often one of those gems sticks its head above the parapet and you think, I love this stuff. This is great, isn't it?
That's it. I suppose it's the same with a lot of these subgenres. I think it kind of it has quite a lot of links to slashers in a way.
Yeah.
Quite schlocky. There are a lot of bad ones, but there are also some gems as well, aren't
I
there?
think the
That's
problem is they're
thing.
quite easy to make.
Yes.
If you're going to make a
yes.
vampire film, you kind of need someone who can act, a bit charismatic to be the vampire. If you're going to do werewolves, you've got to be able to have a good transformation effect.
Yeah.
If you want to do a zombie apocalypse, you just need some cheap makeup. You need a few, YouTube tutorial videos. Slap it on your mates. They all go "Ooh," and walk around a lot, and you've got an instant zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
They're so easy to do, and I think that's the problem. People think it's easy. I'll do one.
Yes.
But they don't think, what am I actually adding to this? What am I bringing?
Yes.
What new am I doing with the zombie at this stage?
Exactly. And what actually is it about zombie films that make them so good? Because I think, as we'll, I'm sure, discuss, I don't think really a lot of the time it's actually about the zombies.
It's not at all. Not the good ones.
No,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
what's fascinating about the good zombie movies, I think. That
they're because they are literally a blank slate.
Exactly.
They look like us. And they kind of move like us, but they're not
Yes.
really us. And we can project all our fears and anxieties onto them. And that's where they're really good. There are some great films that don't have a thought in their head. I mean,
Yes.
Zombie Flesh Eaters is probably my favourite zombie film ever.
It's fantastic.
It's absolutely brain dead, but
Yes.
it's brilliant. It's wonderful.
Yes.
But when you get sort of people like Ramiro and
Yeah.
Cronenberg and people like that who really clever guys who use the zombie as a blank slate to project onto it social fears, social anxieties,
Yeah.
then you've got something a bit special.
Definitely.
If it's just another zombie apocalypse,
Yes.
really, who cares? you know?
Exactly. We've seen it all before.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics then. As ever, I'm going to ask you, what is a zombie?
That's a really big question.
It is.
So-
It is.
And it's pure. If we're going to be purists,
Yes.
and we're not, because purists are a pain in the arse, so we're not going to be purists. But if we're being purists, it's a dead body that's been revived,
Right.
been brought back to life. That isn't strictly the case anymore. I think we have this thing. I like to think of it being zombie adjacent.
Yes.
They're kind of like zombies, but they're not really. I mean, we'll touch on things later on, like the Cronenberg film, like 28 Days Later, things like that. These people aren't dead, but they behave in the same way as
Yes.
zombies. But going back to the beginning, the zombies kind of, it's almost unique in movie monsters. Its origin could be pinpointed to a very specific time, place and culture.
Yes.
Vampires, they were everywhere. Ghosts in every culture, as we spoke about last time.
Yeah.
Even mummy films, you think, that must be Egypt. But no, they were in South America as well.
Right,
Mummification in China and so on. The zombie, we can pinpoint it right back down to the Caribbean. And specifically to Haiti,
Yes.
although it was the idea of the zombie was prevalent throughout the region, but Haiti is the place that we now associate with the zombie.
Yeah.
It all comes from voodoo, which was the religion practiced by the African slaves that had been brought over, particularly in Haiti. When the white settlers came in, they pretty much eradicated the entire native population
Yes.
and rebuilt the population with slaves from Africa
Yeah.
who came over with their native religions. Then that got sort of cross-pollinated with Catholicism, and the result was voodoo, which we
Right.
call voodoo. And it's a fantastically rich culture, voodoo. There's so much, all the different gods and deities and all the rest of it. But one of the sort of parts of it is the idea of the zombie. the witch doctors, the sorcerers, can bring back a dead person to use as their slave.
Yes.
And that's originally what they were for. They were there to be brought back as slaves. And in fact, slavery sort of plays a big part in the whole zombie mythology, that a lot of the slave drivers on the plantations used to spread the myth that if the slaves committed suicide, which a lot of them wanted to do because it was a dreadful life, they didn't want to stay alive in all this, that they would come back as a zombie.
Yes.
And the fear of that, the fear of coming back, and they could still use their body to still be slaves but without any of their free will.
It's a terrifying, actually,
Absolutely
origin,
terrifying.
isn't it?
It is, absolutely, really dark. The whole voodoo thing, I can really recommend people having a read up on the history of voodoo and getting into the culture and finding out about all the deities and stuff. It's fascinating stuff.
What I've also found really interesting looking into it is there's this kind of superstition religious side to it, but there's also this scientific background to it.
That came much later.
It did.
That came much later. When even in the early years of the cinema, zombies, it was all pretty much the Caribbean.
Yes.
It can be split into two periods, really.
Yes.
So there was BR and AR, before Ramiro, after Ramiro. And basically before Ramiro, it's all pretty much the sort of the voodoo based stuff.
Yeah.
After Ramiro, with one or two exceptions, which we'll touch on, it's mostly scientific. They become more science fiction films.
They do. They do.
Post Ramiro, they're more sort of supernatural horror.
Yes.
In the early years.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting. You can actually mark that line, 1968. That's when
agree.
it all changed. You know?
And actually, I think that we'll get into this, but I think that there's a difference in a weird way between a film with zombies in it, like some of the early ones, and a zombie movie.
Oh, most
and
definitely.
for me, I would say Night of the Living Dead is actually the first zombie movie that we think of as a zombie movie narrative.
I mean, we could say, that. I think a lot of people think of White Zombie as being the first zombie film, because
Which it absolutely is. Literally,
but
yes.
Just to sort of pick up on your point, I would actually make a case for Jacques, the Abel Gance film from 1919, which is a little bit of a spoiler here, but don't let it put you off, because this is a fabulous film, and this is just a small part of it. It's an anti-war parable, made in 1918, released in 1919. It was made while the First World War was still rumbling on.
Yes.
And there's an extraordinary scene towards the end where thousands of soldiers on the battlefield have been killed, get up and walk back to their homes.
Wow.
And it's meant to be this sort of thing, this is the reality of war.
Yes.
Abel Gance was really he was really pissed off by the fact that most civilians were sort of sitting there thinking, oh, it'll all be over by Christmas. And these poor guys on the front line were being massacred.
Yes.
And indeed, the zombies, if you like, in his film were all played by French serving soldiers who were on leave. And the poignancy is that they all went back to the front.
Right.
And I think Gantz said it was 80% of them didn't come back after that. They played these dead soldiers knowing that they would be dead very soon. But that might well be the first zombie film. It's not the first zombie film, it's the first film with zombies in it.
Yes.
And so, there is a distinction between the two.
There is.
Yeah, and White Zombie is kind of it is a zombie film, isn't it? Because it's got the word zombie in it.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Yeah, I just think there's that interesting slight kind of sort of two ways of thinking about some of these subgenres, and I kind of felt the same with slashers, because yes, you can get a movie about a man with a knife killing people, but it's not always necessarily a slasher movie.
Absolutely.
And you can get a sort of body count film like Final Destination, which isn't really about a man in a mask, but it kind of is a slasher movie because I guess slasher evolved to be a format rather than also literally involving a slasher. And I think there's something of that to zombies as well. When we talk about, like we will, things like Pontypool and things like that, there's 28 Days Later, they follow a zombie format, but they're not literally zombies.
These are the zombie adjacents that I like to think of. They look like zombies and they behave like zombies, but they're kind of not. But what's interesting about 1968 and Night of the Living Dead is almost overnight it kind of eradicated the Caribbean school of zombie movies. Up until then, it had all been sort of derived from that culture. Post 1968, you really struggle to find any films that have anything to do with bringing zombies back through magic and religion. It's all about science after that.
And also there is this kind of element, and I learned this from things like The Serpent and the Rainbow, so I'm assuming this isn't all completely fact, but...
Oh, no, it's a documentary, Serpent and the Rainbow. Everybody knows this,
But, there is this kind of... sciencey background, even to this Caribbean,
Yes.
quote unquote zombie,
Yeah.
and what happened to these people, isn't there? Because there was this stuff that what's his name,
Wade Davis.
Wade Davis
Yes.
discovered,
Yeah.
and he discovered this strange kind of chemical that came from sort of puffer fishes and things like that. That's
It's
right,
been
isn't it?
questioned
Yeah.
quite a lot by his peers since then. But yes,
Yeah.
the basis is there that obviously the guys that were doing this, they weren't really bringing people back from the dead. I mean,
No.
much as I would love to believe in all that stuff,
Yeah.
people, when you're dead, you're dead. You don't come
Yes.
back. What they were doing were putting people in zombie-like trances. They were
Yes.
putting people in states that looked like they were dead, and then bringing them back as sort of empty shells, but they were still alive.
Yeah.
And so yes, they were doing it with all these chemicals and things. They knew they had a sort of innate knowledge of all the poisons and
Yes.
all the rest of it, and that's exactly what it was. It was a scientific element to it, but it was sold to the people
Yes.
as religion,
Yes.
because that was the best way to control them.
Yeah.
I was working in the Amazon, and one day he summoned me to his 4th floor eyrie at the Botanical Museum and asked me if I wanted to sort of go down to Haiti for 2 weeks over spring break and try to find the formula of the drug used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said, sure. There are lots of plants and lots of animals that are poisonous and that can kill you. We weren't just looking for a toxin that could kill. We were looking for a toxin that could bring on a state of apparent death so profound that it would bring someone literally to the edge of death, a threshold from which they could then recover.
So Wade Davis, as we mentioned, was this scientist. He was a kind of he was an anthropologist and an ethnobotanist, and he basically went out to Haiti and sort of investigated this myth, this folklore of the voodoo zombie, and tried to sort of uncover whether or not there were any truth to these accounts, these apparently eyewitness accounts of people that had come back from the dead. There was a very famous story that he actually discussed in his book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, which then got obviously made into the Wes Craven movie. This man, I think his name was Clevius Narcisse, who was said to have actually been turned into a zombie by voodoo magic. He was pronounced dead, medically dead. He was actually examined. The pathology all confirmed it. And then years later, he was seen back from the dead, wandering through this village. And when Wade Davis sort of investigated it and went to the island, he discovered that there might be some actual scientific chemical reasoning behind this. And as I mentioned, there's this strange chemical called tetrodotoxin, which comes from pufferfish, which can actually be sort of said to do that, to kind of replicate the effects of death, but they're only temporary. So apparently, according to some of these theories, what some of these Haitian people would do is actually grind up this kind of chemical into powder and mix it with broken glass and leave it on the doorsteps of people that they wanted to infect. And when this person would walk out of their house in bare feet, they would step over the broken glass, the tetrodotoxin would go into their bloodstream, and it would suddenly start to infect them. And the side effects of this chemical is that you essentially appear medically dead. Your heart completely stops. It puts you in some sort of death-like condition. And so Wade Davis posited that maybe, Narcisse was actually infected by this poison. He was pronounced officially medically dead. He was buried, and then when this chemical wore off, his heart started again. He came back to life and actually was then able to dig himself out of his own grave and return to his village. But when you come back from this kind of death-like state, from this tetrodotoxin, you're left sort of brain dead. You're in this kind of vegetable-like state where apparently you can no longer talk, you can only grunt, you can't move very well, you kind of shuffle and drag your feet, and you are, by all intents and purposes, a zombie, an undead. So it's fascinating to think that actually some of this kind of superstition and witchcraft, voodoo, magic may have actually been rooted in some kind of scientific fact, and that there might actually be such a thing as an undead zombie.
We never could prove really anything, but we could show that this was something that had a kind of coherence within the worldview of the Haitian people. If it could not be absolutely proven, it was at least so provocative that it demanded investigation. If you eliminate the other possibilities, you have to allow the facts to speak for themselves. And that's why I was prepared to say very strongly that I thought this phenomenon existed.
And what a fantastic way to terrorise a population into behaving themselves.
Yes.
You don't behave yourself, this is what's going to happen.
Oh,
you know,
God,
so
what a
every
terrifying-
religion has that kind of element of fear to it.
Yes.
You know, if you don't behave yourself, you go to hell. But to actually see that, to actually see, you know, it's like you can kind of visualise hell in your head, but to actually see that's what you're going to turn into if you're a bad boy.
It's
it's like, that
amazing.
is terrifying.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, really, really scary stuff. And you know, there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, there is, and again we'll get into this, but there is a kind of disease element to zombies as well. Obviously, there's a kind of whole, you know, subsection of zombie movies that are now kind of the infection genre and that kind of thing, isn't there?
Absolutely. Well, you know, we live in a world where infection is an ever-present worry.
Yes.
You know, 28 days later, if I remember right, that came out just before the big SARS outbreak, which I'm absolutely convinced was all down to, you know, the success of the film was really partly to do with that people were terrified that these new illnesses that we don't seem to be able to control, that we don't seem to have, we like to think we've got control over the world. Science controls the world. Sorry guys, it doesn't, and science has never claimed that it does. These pandemics are coming. They're going to happen any day now.
We're overdue one, apparently, which terrifies
massively,
me.
Absolutely.
I think we do live in fear of that. I mean, every time you hear, you know, bird flu, swine flu, all these different things, you know, everyone is in absolute fear for a few months, and then it kind of, people forget about it and it dies away.
Don't you think, like me, when you hear that, you think, oh, zombies. You know, that's exactly what you hear. As soon as you hear there's a pandemic coming, you think, oh my God, they're all going to get up and eat me.
Totally. You know, there's links to even things like mad cow disease, which was a big thing in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah,
you know, obviously, as the title suggests, you know, it affects your brain, affects your motor reflexes, your speech, all kinds of things, and it was passed through you know, humans could get it from eating the flesh of the people of the cows that had it.
And there was that fear, wasn't there, of the loss of individuality that came with the brain damage and so on, and that really is a big part of the whole zombie culture right from the beginning.
Yes.
That it looks like you. It's got your body, but you're not in there anymore.
Yes.
And that's a really scary prospect. I think probably the most frightening for me prospect in horror.
Definitely.
Is, you know, the fact that I could wake up one day and I won't be in the body anymore.
Yeah.
My body will carry on without me.
Yes.
And God, if anybody wants this body, seriously, they've got more problems than I've got. But, you know, it's like, seriously, you're welcome to it. But, you know what I mean? It's that loss of identity. Becoming part of a mob, becoming part of a crowd, disappearing, becoming faceless, becoming part of the crowd. That's really, I think, what modern zombie films trade on the most. Whether they have other things going on, but I think underneath it all, it is sort of saying, if you're not careful, you're just going to become one of the crowd, no brain, you're just going to be following the pack.
Yes.
And, you know, the troubled times that we live in, that's a very, very, very frightening thought.
It really is. It really is. And so sort of going back to that beginning stage again, I mean, it like you say, it originated from this kind of folklore and religion, I suppose, from the Caribbean, didn't it? And it seems to be one of the few classic kind of, you know, we talked about White Zombie, one of the few kind of classic 1930s monster movies that wasn't based on kind of literature, I suppose, or in some way, some existing text.
There was a play in 1932 called Zombie. Which was... It didn't do very well, apparently. I know very little about it, I must confess. But from what I gather, and what little I gather, we're not missing much. Apparently it was quite dull. But that seems to be the only literary antecedent to it. And there's no European folklore surrounding the zombie. So this was all imported from another culture.
Yes.
And you know how resistant Western culture is to importing anything from the outside. So it took a long while before zombies actually became part of popular culture. And even in the 30s, I think they tried.
Yes.
But it didn't really become a thing, you know. They were very sporadic. They were just...
Yeah, they were. It didn't obviously take off, did it, like the vampire movie or the Frankenstein or whatever?
Because they got, you know... We talked about this in the ghost story, didn't we? That the ghost stories are seen as being fairly respectable.
Yes.
Because Shakespeare wrote a ghost story and Dickens wrote a ghost story and proper they never wrote zombie stories. You know, there is no Charles Dickens' Night of the Living Dead. It never happened, you know. So it's a much more scurrilous subgenre than something like ghosts or even vampires, which has, you know, some literary antecedents. And of course, because we never grew up with it as part of our background mythology.
Yes.
You know, it took a long while to take root. Now that it has, it's become almost the predominant mythology.
Feels like it, doesn't it? Yeah.
Which is kind of an interesting reversal, really.
Yes, definitely.
From Haiti, land of the voodoo, comes the most infamous cult of all. Bela Lugosi as Murder Legendre, The white zombie obeys the unholy commands of her demon master.
And again, even those old ones, the zombies are kind of almost on the periphery, the actual zombies themselves. You've got this movie that is really about Bela Lugosi's character, the kind of witch doctor.
Of course, yeah. But the zombies are almost kind of an excuse for him to show off his powers.
Yes.
It's only really at the end that they become quite menacing.
Exactly.
And then they're disposed of quite quickly. Yeah. No spoiler. It's just, the zombies are going to get got rid of quite easily. But yeah, I mean, they are sort of supporting characters in their own film in a lot of ways. It is about the zombie master.
Yes.
And a lot of the films were about the zombie master in the early days.
Yeah.
But that, again, it was Night of the Living Dead. We will come to it. It changed everything.
And we'll come to that in a minute, definitely. And and then we had the another kind of big zombie movies of the sort of pre-Night of the Living Dead era was I Walked with a Zombie, wasn't it? The Val Lewton, Jacques Tourneur
Which,
film.
of course, had a kind of respectability because they sort of harped on about the fact that it was kind of based on Jane Eyre.
Yes.
And so they were able to sort of crowbar in a little bit of literary... And it didn't need it because it's a fantastic film.
Yes.
I mean, it's a stunning piece of work.
This is the ceremony of voodoo death, a ceremony that seeks the life of the woman who lives forever, who walks with the dead.
Val Lewton kind of tried to lend a bit of respectability to genre films, didn't he?
Absolutely.
Even back then, yeah.
And it's like there is this sort of question: do we need to be seen to be respectable?
Yes.
The horror movie.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. I kind of like it occasionally when people look at something like I Walked with a Zombie and say, what a terrible title, but what a great film. And Lewton was always sort of complaining about that they were giving him these titles like Curse of the Cat People. Yes. He didn't want to make a film called Curse of the Cat People. He didn't.
No,
but
he had other ideas.
He had other ideas, but
he
thought, okay, the marketing people, let's give them that, and then we'll go and make something they don't expect.
Yes.
And I Walked with a Zombie is not at all like any other zombie film of the period or even for many years to come, actually. It's an astonishing film.
It's incredible, and not at all, and again, we're going to talk about this in depth next week, but it's not at all what you think, really. And again, the zombies are kind of really on the periphery of that story.
They're skulking around the edges, which in some ways makes them more frightening, I think. It's
definitely.
I've always this is kind of an analogy I have with my beloved Doctor Who.
Yes.
Back in the old days, the Cybermen used to skulk around the edges. They were in the shadows and in the dark, and they were quiet. And they were bloody scary. Now they clank about in broad daylight. It's like, oh, they're just robots, aren't they?
Yes.
You did not get. That's what was
mystique.
great about. Yeah, it's just apparently that wonderful scene where the two women are walking through the fields at night, and they meet Carfor standing there, which is just standing there. He doesn't do anything. But it's absolutely chilling.
Yes.
It's a fantastic moment because it's like he's right on the edge of the action.
Yes.
And it's very, very, very creepy indeed.
Definitely. Now, do you think, I mean, these movies, obviously, they're old movies, and are they dated now in the way they portray, I suppose, kind of Haiti and Caribbean kind of culture? And because, again, there's an interesting link there, isn't there, intentionally or unintentionally, with kind of race and that kind of thing when it comes to the zombie subject.
There is, and that's, I think, inevitable given the time in which they were made.
Yes.
It's very easy for us from our perspective to tut furiously at these films, and quite rightly in some respects, but they were made when they were made.
Yeah.
And the people who made them had very different attitudes, very different beliefs. And yes, sometimes they can be quite problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the cheaper ones that were around at the time, some of those monogram films like King of the Zombies and Revolt of the Zombies and so on, they're particularly troublesome.
Yes.
I think I Walked with a Zombie, I think it kind of gets away with it.
I think it does.
But there is a nagging doubt, I think. It did that I think only one film, which we'll come to eventually in the 60s, really sort of questioned that, really sort of went to town on that in any way.
Yeah.
For the most part, it was just seen as the thing.
It was.
Black people back then had even harder time than they have today.
Yes. And their culture were other, weren't they? That's the thing.
It was other. That does inform a lot of these films, and that is a problem. That is an issue. I think sometimes you have to step back from it and look at it and think, okay, these films were made in the 1940s. They're even older than I am, and that's saying something. And it's just. It's not to say that we should forgive them for doing that, not at all. But I think we have to try and understand.
We have to bear that in mind.
Yeah,
I agree. It's always going to be the way with any old film, isn't it? There's always going to be elements to them that you
anything
think,
more than
this
10
wouldn't-"
years old, to be honest, is starting to get, did we really think like that 10 years ago? And in 10 years' time, people will look back at what we're thinking now and think, really?
Yes,
so
exactly,
it's just, we have to, it's context.
It
I
is.
think, it's so important to keep the context of when these films were made, who made them,
Yes.
and what the target audience was.
Yes.
The target audience was not Haitians.
No, exactly.
It was white
exactly.
America.
Exactly.
So,
And do you think is there a this is probably a bit of a difficult question because of the way the zombie film changed in 1968, but could you boil zombies down to a fundamental fear? What is it that makes zombies or zombie movies scary, do you think?
I think it is, as we touched on just now, I think it is that loss of self.
Yes.
That when you become, there've been some really good films. There's a wonderful film which doesn't get enough. Harold's turning stiff. Harold's going. I can't remember the exact title of it, which is wonderful. It is about an old man slowly turning into a zombie,
Right.
and it is about the loss. It's all tied in with dementia and so on. He's losing himself. And there's I, Zombie, The Chronicles of Pain,
Yes.
which again is about someone very slowly losing themselves to this infection.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's scary about zombie films. Even back then, when you were made a slave,
Yes.
even after death.
Yes.
I mean, for a black audience, that must have been
Really terrifying.
That must be
yeah.
absolutely terrifying. That
Yeah.
even death, they can't give us the dignity of death.
No.
They'll come and bring us back
Yeah.
and still use us as slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a really terrifying prospect. And I think then translates out to, all the really good zombie films, that we lose who we are.
Yes.
We're no longer who we are anymore. And that is really scary.
Definitely.
Really
definitely.
scary.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think, the zombies kind of feel like an interesting sort of cipher for other themes or other issues or other
Absolutely.
big, things to cover, aren't they?
The really, truly great ones, the ones that will be remembered for, decades to come, I think are the ones that sort of look at social issues, political issues.
Yes.
And the zombie's quite a good one for that because it doesn't really allow you to beat people over the head with a message.
No.
There is one film which we will come to, and they're building the Wicker Man for me afterwards when I talk about how I'm not a great fan of Dawn of the Dead. Let's put that out there. And they're out there now building the Wicker Man. I'm not going to make it home after this. I'm really not. I'm in so much trouble. I'm going to have to hang up my fanboy credentials on the way out.
We've all been there. I won't get into Suspiria, my own views on Suspiria. So there you go. We'll
right, that's it. No, that's it. We're in trouble now. But I think sometimes we'll talk about it. But I think that film sort of overdid it slightly. But it's very difficult, I think, to overdo the sort of the metaphor with a zombie film because a zombie is sometimes just a zombie, and it does allow for certain subtleties, I think, to creep through. There are some films where you're watching them and you think, this is just a great zombie film. Then afterwards you think, hang on a minute, that was about I get
else.
it now. Yeah, exactly. And then, really skilled filmmakers will do that.
Definitely.
The people who are just making it in their back garden shed, I don't think they give a damn one way or the other. But the really good filmmakers, they know they want to say something. And the zombies become a wonderful metaphor.
Definitely. They are a brilliant metaphor, aren't they? That's it.
Young Martinus also says that he saw something on the moors, something that he insists was his brother. But we know that his brother is dead. We also know that he is not lying in his coffin. Someone in this village is practicing witchcraft. That corpse wandering on the moors is an undead, a zombie.
So when we get into the 60s, even Hammer tried their hand at a zombie movie, didn't they?
Did.
What did you think of that?
One. Well, I think it's a fabulous film. In fact, I have it's a little personal story here.
Yeah.
When I first started getting into horror movies, sort of late 70s, and I can remember my dad... parents back then were even more concerned about kids watching horror movies. And, they were getting a bit worried. I was a teenager, but they were still worried about me watching stuff. And I remember my dad saying, watch what you like, but don't watch zombie movies.
Ooh,
I said, why not? And he said, I saw this film and it was horrible. And he went on to describe what was very clearly, as I found out later, the graveyard, the nightmare scene from Plague of the Zombies. And I would have been 4 when that came out. My brother was, 3. My sister hadn't been born. But I suppose it was just a night out for the parents.
Yes.
And they went out and scared the crap out of themselves watching this film. And, the zombie always had a special place for me because they terrified my dad. Yeah. And this was the film that did it. And I can quite understand it, having seen it subsequently, that nightmare sequence is
horrible.
Is amazing. I was saying earlier about the sort of pre-Romero films didn't really sort of make much of a play for political issues. I think Plague of the Zombies, maybe by accident, kind of does. I think it has some things to say about colonialism,
yes,
and about the class system.
Yeah.
And I think whether that was intended or not,
yes,
I don't know. I can hear a lot of my Hammer-loving friends already groaning at the very thought that I brought this up. But
I think it's a great shout, definitely.
But I think it is there. I think, if you want to see it, I think that's one of the earliest films you can look at and think, actually, there's a point to this, isn't there? This isn't just zombies.
Yes.
There is actually something else going on here as well.
Also, I still had a bit of my folk horror head on when watching that as well.
Yes.
And I thought all these kind of Cornish villagers and these kind of, I had a bit of that to it as well.
Well, pre-Romero,
I
think we could make an argument that zombie films are an extension of folk horror because they are coming out of a folk religion.
Yes.
And so, I mean, pre-Romero, definitely, there's a folk horror element to it. And certainly Plague of the Zombies definitely plays into that. Definitely.
But what's very interesting about that film is that I think it is we're kind of transitioning gradually here because it feels like Plague of the Zombies. It draws on that kind of old that old sort of voodoo zombie, but the look of the zombies, the way those shots in that dream sequence of them coming out of the ground, of they're kind of dead behind the eyes, the sort of groans, it feels like that's the look of a zombie right there.
It's a stepping stone, isn't it, from the old school zombies, which tended to be just people sort of with slightly sort of starey eyes, into zombies that were actually dead bodies that were falling apart.
Yes, corpses.
Yes. So this was actually the beginning. That was kind of the transition film, really, for that. So there were a lot of other zombie films around the time, but they didn't really have that kind of look to them. There was an interesting 1959 film, actually, which kind of did in a way, and Edward L. Kahn's Invisible Invaders.
Right.
Not a great film by any means. It's a pretty awful film, actually, but it did have aliens bringing dead bodies back to life.
Right. Yeah.
And they are a bit mouldery at times, a bit sort of pasty and a bit sort of, it's sort of a little step forward. And it's interesting the way the zombies move in that. They do move with that sort of stiff armed, sort of stiff legged shuffle that we came to know from the Romero films.
Exactly.
So I think, sort of that and then Plague of the Zombies, they were sort of stepping stones towards what would eventually happen in 1968.
It does feel like that, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
I wonder whether Romero was a fan of Plague of the Zombies, because it did feel like he's kind of aesthetically took some elements from that.
Well, it's interesting. I think Romero's talked about things like Last Man on Earth, the Vincent Price film, and you can definitely see that as an influence. You can definitely see that as a forerunner.
And of course, I Am Legend,
I Am
the
Legend,
book, I Am Legend. Yeah. I think that was a big stepping stone, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, in the book, they are sort of presented as vampires, but they're kind of zombie-like vampires.
Yes.
They travel in packs. They're not terribly bright. We've got the leader who is, but most of them are kind of a bit animalistic.
Yeah.
And, sort of Last Man on Earth captures that quite well, I think.
Yeah. And it does feel like there's a link here, like these kind of zombie movies become almost like apocalypse movies, I suppose, don't they? Which, again, I Am Legend. It's that kind of... what I think is fun, what people love to do these days, what me and my friends love to do at uni when we all watch zombie movies would go, what would you do? How would you survive? It's that Shaun of the Dead thing. Like, what could you use in your house as an instrument to kill zombies? Whatever it might be.
Well, it's interesting that we sort of were well equipped, really, to sort of survive a zombie apocalypse because we've seen so many of them. And it's funny, a friend of mine at work was saying this morning about The Walking Dead, that The Walking Dead exists in a parallel universe where nobody has seen a zombie film. And he's like, they have no idea how to survive a zombie apocalypse, but we kind of do because we've seen it happening so many times. We immediately know this is what we should do now
what you
because
could use.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
it's great.
Listen to us talking about it like it's going to happen.
Yes, exactly. Well, you never know.
Night of the Living Dead. A bizarre adventure in fear.
So obviously, we get to Night of the Living Dead then. Now, what an important film, I think, for so many reasons. And we don't want to spend hours on this, but it feels like to me like the kind of ultimate sort of transition movie between old horror and new horror. To be very, very general. Do you know what I mean?
It is a line in the sand, isn't it?
Yes,
it really is.
Feels like that.
It's up until then. Not every horror film of the 50s was sort of gothic, and all of the 60s, but the ones we tend to think of at that time were the Hammer films, the Coleman films, and so on. It was all very gothic. It was all very sort of, set in the past. Yeah. Night of the Living Dead is very, very obviously set in the real world.
Yeah.
We see them watching television. We see them behaving in ways that are totally recognisable to us immediately. And the timing of it was staggering.
Yeah.
The timing of it was, whatever else we may think about Romero, and I love the guy. He's amazing. I mean, despite my doubts about Dawn of the Dead. I love the guy.
Yeah.
And he was so clever.
Yeah.
He was so clever. He was basically trying to make a Bergman-esque film about teenagers in medieval times.
I love that so many horror film directors wanted to do the Virgin Spring at this time.
Yeah,
It's so interesting.
They wanted to be proper
Yes,
and respectable.
yes.
And nobody would fund it. So we thought, oh, to hell with it, we'll make a horror film. Because that make money, wouldn't it? We can't. And, you know, obviously, you'll talk about this, I'm sure, in the episode about how they didn't make money on it. But that was the idea. We'll make a horror movie. But Romero was far too clever to just make a horror film. He looked around him and he saw what was going on in the States at the time, the civil rights movements, you know, the cities erupting in violence, Vietnam.
Yeah.
And all of this informs every single second of
really
Night of the
does.
Living Dead. You know, it is the
really does.
first film, really, the first horror film that does that, I think, that actually sort of looks at the world around you and says, this is where we're going.
Totally. That's it, wasn't it? It was and it starts a wave of, I think, the most interesting period of horror ever.
Oh, yes.
That kind of next 10 years following, you know, through Vietnam, through Watergate, that kind of period of America is just fascinating.
I've always said my favourite period of horror. I mean, I love stuff from before and after, but my favourite, if I went home tonight and was going to watch a film from a period of horror, it would be from Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead.
Yes, yeah.
Through to Reanimator. That to me was the golden age.
Exactly.
I love all the Hammer films.
Yeah.
I love all the Universal films. I love all of that stuff. But that for me, maybe because, you know, I was seeing a lot of those films in the cinema, a lot of the late 60s films were still around in the late 60s when I was going. Maybe there's a nostalgia part to it.
Yeah.
But to me, that was a real flowering of invention and commitment by the filmmakers, you know.
And just this kind of, the commitment, the nihilism, the bleakness of these movies at this period as well.
I don't think there have been that many horror films that end like Night of the Living Dead.
No.
You know, the hero does, and apologies, if you haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, you're in the wrong place. Stop listening to me dribbling on, go watch it and come back to me later. But to have that poor guy do everything right and then meet that end, it's such a kick in the guts, much more so than the gore, the violence, and all the rest of it. That's the bit that affects me most, is what happens at the end.
And actually going forward into, I think one of the, you know, we'll get to this in a minute properly, but one of the most underrated, one of my favourite Romero films is Day of the Dead, and it's this idea of just humans being the most monstrous people of all,
absolutely.
You know, more than the zombies.
And a lot of the great zombie films, the zombies aren't really the problem. When you look at Walking Dead on TV, the problem isn't the zombies. No. If people had stopped being arseholes to each other, you'd actually survive that apocalypse quite easily. It's just people are absolute gits to each other. Yes. And that's what's interesting, is that the zombies are kind of there in the background. Yeah. And it's putting people under pressure, and it then brings out the worst in us. Yeah. And Romero was very good at that. Romero was very good at putting people under pressure, and this is what's going to happen if you don't sit down and talk about it. Definitely. If you don't sit down and talk about it, the zombies are going to get in and eat you. And it's a very simple message, but it's brilliantly done.
Yes. And it comes back to that that thing I was just saying about what would you do? And there are so many, there's a kind of mundanity about Night of the Living Dead, where there's a whole chunk of the film, it feels like a big middle part of the film where characters are just arguing about whether to go in the basement or go upstairs, basically.
Yeah. Which is exactly what you would do in real life. And it is that thing where, you know, this poor guy, he does everything right, and he just meets these idiots from the basement who, you know, obviously, when Romero wrote the script, he didn't write it for a black actor. He wrote it, and Dwayne Jones turned up and they thought, you're doing it. But you can't escape that feeling that guy in the basement was an absolute racist bastard. You know, and it was there bubbling away under the surface the whole time. Definitely. You know, and that was what was so clever about Night of the Living Dead. It was subtle. Despite all the, you know, the dead bodies and the exploding trucks and all the rest of it, there's a subtlety to it which I absolutely love.
It's incredible, isn't it? And it was just such, again, a kind of crazy revolutionary thing that he just cast him as the main role, but there is not he didn't change anything about the script. No. So there is not a single mention about the fact that this character is black. No,
absolutely.
But they don't have to, you know.
And there's a really good film called Birth of the Living Dead, which is a documentary about Night of the Living Dead, and they've got several black academics on there talking about when they saw it for the first time, and actually engaging with the character, because not a big deal was made of the fact that he was black. He was just this competent guy who knew what he was doing. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't all the stereotypes that we've seen of black people in films up to that point. Yeah. He was just a guy. Yeah. And he was as frightened as we were. Yeah. He was a bit, his head was screwed on a bit tighter than some of the other characters. Yes. He knew what was what. And then at the end, the rednecks get him.
Oh, it's a real...
And, you know, you think, oh, wow, that is just so, you know...
it's a real... I mean, nothing will ever Nothing will ever stop the impact of that ending for
Not
me.
at all. No.
I feel it every time when you get those kind of still photographs.
Yes, and that sudden burst into motion again at the end when the flames start.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely
really wonderful.
It is one of the most shocking sequences in horror history.
Yeah,
I think.
it is. But we won't get into that for too long.
No,
we're going
no.
to end up down a wormhole here. But yeah, another interesting thing, just in terms of it being a kind of transition movie as well, is that it does feel like there are elements of the kind of old horror in it still.
Yes.
The score feels almost quite Hammer-esque or something, doesn't it?
It was library music, so they were using cues that were they've been used before in horror films. So yes, there is that, and then you get this whole different look to it, which we'd never seen before.
Exactly.
And it's difficult to understand now how shocking the idea of human beings eating each other must have been in 1968. That must have been, now we take it for granted zombies eat people, that's what they do. But at the time, the ghouls, not called zombies. I don't think they ever call zombies in any of his films, actually, come to think of it. But to see them eating people, that must have been the real shock. To have this sort of old style music, an old style setting. It's just a base under siege thriller, isn't it? It's just people trapped in a house, a bit like the Birds. They're all trapped in the house, and there's this force trying to get out. It lulls you into that false sense of security. We're going to get a tradition. Oh my God, they're eating people. That must have been a real kicker when that happened.
Definitely. And again, that's the thing. It feels weird now to think that was almost a reveal, a twist.
Yes.
2/3 of the way in. These zombies are eating people. They're not just killing. They're eating flesh.
They're hunting us for food. When they're not trying to kill us because they're psychopaths. They're killing us because they want to stay alive, want to stay undead. Exactly. And that was what was a real sort of. I think that's the major change of that film.
Yes, exactly. So at this point, and the irony is they weren't even called zombies, but this is what invented the zombie essentially as we know it, isn't it?
And every zombie film made since then owes a huge debt to Night of the Living Dead.
Yes. And again, there's something scary about the fact that this isn't controlled by a witch doctor or a person or a spell or a science. It's just there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just all of a sudden, like Romero always famously says, the rules have changed. Like, that's it. When you're dead now, you don't stay dead. And this is the world.
God changed the rules.
Yes,
was his phrase. God changed the rules. And there's a vague talk about a satellite and radiation. So we never
again a hint of 50s horror there, isn't
exactly.
there?
But we never find out in all of the 6 films.
No.
I'm sorry to bring up the other 3, but
yes.
in all of the 6, I'm definitely in trouble now. I'm bringing up those. But in all of them, there's no one ever finds out what caused it.
No.
We never know.
No.
It's just shit happens and deal with it. And that happens a lot in Romero's films. Stuff just happens. You just have to get on with it. In the Crazies.
Yes.
We know what caused it, but there's nothing you can do about it. You just got to get on with it. And the Crazies is a zombie film.
It is. It absolutely is.
It's the first of the sort of zombie adjacent films in a way.
It really is. It really is. And let's get onto that actually, because as we get into the 1970s, we have movies like The Crazies. We also had a couple of Cronenberg movies, which I think obviously they're not literally zombies, but they have this kind of element, this narrative kind of there is something spreading amongst humans.
It's the spread of disease. We're talking about Shivers and Rabbit.
Shivers and Rabbit,
And it's all about the spread of disease. Again, the loss of identity.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Rabbit, there's even dialogue, isn't there, from Rose, who's sort of saying, I don't think I'm me anymore, that kind of thing, know? And it's just that horror that this thing has got inside you and invaded you and is causing you to do things that you don't want to do. While it's robbing you of everything you are. And Shivers is even more so, I think, with that, because the thing literally gets inside you.
Horrible.
And it basically it's a parasite. It just burns your brain out and just takes over.
Phallic parasite, isn't it?
It's honestly, it's one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen. I adore it, but it freaks me out every
horrible.
time.
That bit with Barbara Steele's in the bath. It's really...
And you see nothing. But it's Cronenberg. The man's just a genius. And we need to do a whole season just on Cronenberg, all right? Because the man he's a genre unto himself. He's
definitely.
amazing,
I am going to do a series on body horror at some point. And again, there are kind of there's a kind of adjacent body horror to zombie horror, isn't there? They are closely related.
Since Night of the Living Dead, it is all about the body.
Exactly.
Prior to that, it was all about the soul. It was about losing your soul and becoming just an empty vessel. After that, it becomes about decay and disease, And we do see in later films in particular that the zombies are gross.
Yes.
I mean, they are falling apart. There's bits dropping off all over, and that's, again, if you actually sit down and think about that, and I hope none of you are listening to this late at night, because you'll start thinking about it now and you won't sleep. If you actually think about, I'm still moving, but bits of me are dropping off.
Yeah.
And it's just...
It's that
horrible.
classic thing which I'm sure Mary Wilde is going to talk to me about, which is kind of fear of the kind of, it's the abject, it's the uncanny,
Yes.
your body is turning on you, it's literally rotting, and you're still trying to
you're
get
still
by.
in there, but this disease is trying to rob you of everything, including your identity eventually.
Yes.
There's just horrific thought.
It's gross. And that's it. Zombie movies became the kind of splattery fun, how much gore can we... Again, very similar to the slasher, and happened at a similar time, it feels like.
It was, I mean, Dawn of the Dead and Halloween were roughly the same time, weren't they?
Right.
So,
Because what it feels like is, I suppose they're quite an interesting comparison. Night of the Living Dead and Halloween both kind of created these subgenres, but they were relative. Night of the Living Dead is still relatively low on gore compared to some of the movies that followed. And then you get the wave of like Dawn of the Dead, Fulci, and everything that followed it, which is, okay, now zombie movies are about how gross can we get. Well, there were all sorts of other reasons as well. I guess that, some censorship was changing. It became easier to do the gore. Yes.
When you got Tom Savini came along.
Oh, yeah.
And, Dawn of the Dead. Let me just qualify what I said earlier.
Yes, let's talk about Dawn of the Dead.
I don't hate Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah.
I like Dawn of the Dead. I think it's a good film. I don't think it's a great film.
Yeah.
That's my argument with it. And one of the many problems I have with it, quite apart from the fact that we spend 2 hours with, sort of the same, being beaten over the head basically with zombies equals consumerism.
Yes.
We get the point, George, so then George gives us a custard pie fight. And it's like, come on, you're better than that. But one of the things is that the zombies, actually, when you see the close-ups of the hero zombies, they're great.
Yes.
The others have got a bit of green paint on them, and the green paint doesn't go all the way down. If the collar moves, you can see they're not painted all the way through.
Yeah, it's the unforgiving technicolor of it, isn't it, as well, in comparison to Night.
Whereas if you come on to something like, zombie flesh eaters, which followed later, they look like they've just been dug up.
Yeah,
they do look revolting, absolutely horrible. That's probably me being unfair on Dawn of the Dead, because
No, I agree. There is that element to it, because I think what was brilliantly... It was so beautiful about Night of the Living Dead was that I don't think he was really thinking about metaphors.
No, he wasn't. It was the simplicity of it.
And it was just there organically. Whereas I think then he went, right, you want subtext? Let's give you some subtext.
And I'm going to give you 2 hours of it beating you over the head with it.
And it's not subtext anymore, it's text. I mean, it's literally, there are lines where the characters go, look, what are they doing? And he's just like, well, they're us, aren't they?
That's
they're
right,
they lay it all out for us.
Spelled out for you. Yes. And I think he got it right again in Day of the Dead.
I think so.
Where he went back and he's like, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about Reagan's America, which is really what the film is about.
Yeah.
But you don't get that immediately.
No.
If you want to see it as just a straight-ahead zombie movie, you can. Whereas Dawn of the Dead, it's a really good film. I just don't think it's the masterpiece that everybody thinks it is. And on that note, thank you. You've been a great life. I love you all.
Turning your mic off, yes.
What exactly did my father die of, Dr. Minoy? And the boat's crew, what happened to them?
What's about the dead coming back to life again and having to be killed a second time?
These islands, fantastic legends, voodooism, zombies, been rife for centuries.
So let's talk briefly about that kind of late 70s, early 80s, kind of what changed here. I mean, like you said, we've touched on it briefly, but you get Fulci and you get kind of directors like that taking on zombies, don't you?
Well, you get good old Lucio Fulci. I mean, the man's a god, isn't he? He's
he is. He really is.
He'd been plodding along in every genre, like all Italian directors. He'd been plodding along in all the popular genres. He'd done his westerns, he'd done his peplum, he'd done everything. Polizieski, all sorts. He'd done a bit of horror.
Don't Torture a Duckling, almost a bit folk horror as well.
Magnificent film, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, the Psychic, he'd
amazing.
Great film.
Yeah.
But then, Zombie, it was released in America, Dawn of the Dead, as Zombie.
Yes, that's right.
And it was produced by Dario Argento, who was at the peak of his powers. It was a massive hit in Italy because of it. And Italy being what it was at the time, copyright was somebody else's problem.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's changed these days or not, but back then he didn't. Copyright, this is a word in the English dictionary. We don't want to worry about that. And Fabrizio De Angelis, the producer, saw how well this film was doing and thought, I want a bit of that. So he got, Dino Sacchetti and Elisa Briganti to write this script, which he called Zombie 2. Zombie 2.
Yeah.
And the brilliant thing about this film really is the marketing.
Yeah.
That when it came over to Britain, Eagle Films brought it over here, and we owe so much to them because they released so much of this stuff.
Yeah.
And they thought, we can't call it Zombie 2 because there isn't a Zombie 1, so we can't call it that. What are we going to call it? And somebody thought, I know, we'll call it Zombie Flesh Eaters. I mean, seriously, how do you walk past the cinema showing a film called Zombie Flesh Eaters and not want to immediately go in and watch this film? And in America, it went out under the slightly dull title of Zombie.
Yes,
But the poster had got a picture of the conquistador zombie with the words, "We are going to eat you."
Yes.
Again, how can you not walk into any sort of drive-in or whatever? It's brilliant bit of marketing.
Amazing.
It helps that it's a fantastic film.
It's so much fun.
It is. That's the key word.
Yeah.
That is the key word. Where a lot of zombie films aren't fun.
Yeah.
They're a bit of a drag.
Yes.
Zombie Flesh Eaters is just fun from
So
beginning
much fun.
to end.
And again, I think if we're looking very broad strokes at the genre in general, I think this is the period when the zombie subgenre became fun.
Yes.
You know, like Night of the Living Dead is brilliant, but it's not fun.
It's
like,
not fun,
It
no.
takes itself very seriously.
And it hurts.
Yeah,
when you watch
it
that film, it hurts. Dawn of the Dead hurts.
Yes,
Day
Dawn
of the Dead hurts. They're very difficult films. You can watch some. As I said earlier, you know, the great zombie films have something to say.
Yeah.
Zombie Flesh Eaters haven't got a brain cell in its head. I mean, it's the thickest film ever made, but it is brilliant. It's so funny and so atmospheric and beautiful, and it's everything I want from a zombie film.
Definitely.
If I was going to go home and watch one zombie film tonight, it's going to be Zombie Flesh Eaters.
Totally,
I love that
totally.
film so
It's
much.
wonderful. And then, you know, whether or not we call them strict zombie films, but we've got a whole run of other Fulci movies following
City of the
this.
Living Dead and The Beyond.
Yeah.
You are Liza, aren't you?
Yes.
My name is Emily. I've been looking for you.
The Beyond is his masterpiece.
Oh,
I
that's
think.
wonderful.
It's just,
Yeah.
It makes no sense. I haven't got a clue what's going on. I've seen it so many times, I couldn't tell you what the hell's going on. But it's just a great film. And the zombies in it, they look like dead people.
Yeah, really
and that's
gross.
they are horrible.
What's his
Really
obsession
nasty.
with eyes as well, and things going into eyes?
Do you know,
it's
one of my
horrible.
big things I have with horror movies is I'm scared of rodents, so
Yes.
I can't watch any scenes with rodents in it. And eyes, I don't like eyeball violence. I love Lucio Fulci. I don't know how that works. There's some sort of weird psychological kink here that I'm attracted to his films when I can't actually watch half of them because of the eyeball violence. But
So much eyeball violence. It's the slow build.
Yes.
Thinking, when are they going to cut away? And they don't.
Everything in Fulci films happens in slow motion. There's that wonderful bit where the conquistadors come back to life.
Yes.
And Oressa Gay just sort of stands there screaming at you, just run away, woman. It's very slow. You know, a brisk walk, you get away from it. She stands screaming at it for half an hour.
Yes,
But that's
exactly.
part of the charm
It's
of
all
it.
part of the
It's why I
charm.
love it.
It's
know?
brilliant, and I love that it does. You know, you get that. It reminds me of going all the way back to, you know, the what's it called in Chien Andalou, where you
Yes.
think, oh, okay, they're not actually going to show us this, and then they still
They
show
still
you
show
it,
that
you know.
anyway.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
Again, one of the most horrible eye scenes I've
And
ever
again,
seen,
that's one of
right?
the beauty of those films of that period when we hadn't seen everything. We kind of seen so much now, but back then there was that sort of, are they really going to do? Oh my God, they just did that. You know, and that was happening a lot in 70s and 80s films that we had because we hadn't seen this stuff before.
Yes.
Now we sort of take it for granted. Eyeballs are popping out all over the place. But
Yes.
back then it was like, he's not really going to do that. Oh, bloody hell,
Bloody
he
hell,
is.
Yeah.
And
And we're
was-
into that just incredible little period there, of
Yes.
the, you know, where you did have movies like, you know, even separate from Zombies, that you had like The Thing and American Werewolf and these incredible kind of practical effects horror.
Yeah,
you know?
and they're sort of showing you things you've never seen before. And even in the sort of zombie cinema, like Evil Dead and
Evil
Brain
Dead.
Dead and things
Yeah.
like that, they're
Where
showing
do-
you things you've never seen before.
I agree. And where do you stand on Evil Dead being a zombie movie?
You made an interesting distinction earlier that there are films that have got zombies in them and that there are zombie films.
Yes.
And I think Evil Dead isn't a zombie film.
Yes,
It's
yes.
a film that's got zombies in it.
Right,
Because I think it's
exactly.
got a lot more going on. There's a lot more to it than just a zombie film.
Yes.
But I think they are zombies.
They are people that are being coming back from the dead.
They're coming back from the dead and they look horrible and they sort of, you know, they're zombies.
Yeah,
but it's not really a zombie film.
No,
it's
not. Whatever you'd call it. I don't know what you'd call it. Kind of cabin in the woods film, wouldn't
a
you?
masterpiece is what I would call it, to be honest. But there you are.
I just watched Evil Dead actually at the BFI here a couple of weeks ago for the Halloween.
Oh,
and it was
yes,
just, I mean, I just love it so
It never
much.
gets old, does it?
never
Every
gets
time you
old.
watch it, there's just, you know, something new to sort of...
And I always have an appreciation, particularly for the first one. I know everyone loves Evil Dead 2 and it is a masterpiece, but Evil Dead...
I'm sorry, I'm another one that...
Well, it's so much more comedic, and I actually still find the first one scary.
The first one is great. The second one is okay.
Yeah.
I don't like the third one very much. I don't know.
No,
I'm not a big fan of Army
I'm
of
not a big
Darkness. I
fan
know
of
it's got
Army of
a
Darkness.
massive fan base, but that's a comedy film with zombies in it.
Yeah, yeah,
Evil
yeah,
Dead
yeah,
is a horror film with zombies in it. I know
Exactly.
it's a subtle difference, but it's there.
Yeah.
The first one is... There's some genuinely scary stuff in that first
horrific.
film.
Shut up.
Not another peep. Kinda go to sleep. We.
It looks a little bit fake now, but the pencil in the ankle
Yeah.
is still one of the most wince-inducing moments in
Absolutely.
cinema. For
Again,
me.
it was another one of the they're not going to do that, are they?
Yeah.
Moments,
Yeah.
you know, and like, oh yeah, they just did, didn't they? That's that is really horrible.
Horrible,
Yeah.
so horrible.
And that I think a zombie film now has to be horrible. I think I think if we made a film, if we went out today and thought, right, we're going to make a film, and what we're going to do, we're going to remake White Zombie.
Yeah.
We'd get laughed out of every finance house in the country.
Yes.
Nobody would want it because I think now zombies are so sort of inextricably linked with horrible body decay and nastiness and just grimness.
Yeah.
And I think, that's no bad thing.
No,
that's all right. I'm quite happy. That's not a complaint in any way.
You know what you're getting from a zombie film, don't
You
you?
do,
That's
yes.
it. People will
Yeah.
say, "Oh no, I don't. I'm not into zombie films at all," or people will go, "Absolutely, sign me up for any new zombie film." Because they are
the amount I watch, and I think, why have I just? I'm getting old. I haven't got time to be watching this rubbish anymore. But it says zombie in the title, so I'm going to watch it. It's like a drug. You just can't stop.
It is, and it's interesting. We've talked about and zombie films. Often, some of the best ones are famous for having kind of subtext or cultural relevance or whatever. And I don't know whether, like we said, these Fulci, these Evil Dead, these kind of really gruey ones from the early 80s, I don't know how much subtext or
whatsoever.
social relevance they have.
None whatsoever.
But they're so well executed, aren't they? That's the thing.
I think if you've got somebody who knows how to do something inventive, you don't need the subtext. No. I think it's when people just keep cranking out the same old zombie apocalypse over and over and over again. Yeah. Actually, literally just occurred to me, and I don't know why this literally just occurred to me. Zombie Fleshes is a kind of a throwback to the earlier films because there is voodoo mentioned in it. It's set in the Caribbean.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. Yeah.
Never occurred to me before. How stupid am I?
Yeah.
But yes, it is.
It's got those roots in the sort of
that is the straddling point between the two schools. That's probably the last of the sort of the really good voodoo zombie films. I'm sure there've been others. But,
I agree, definitely. Yeah, it's really interesting that it is, because I think we so much think of it as rotting Walking Dead. It's not quite the same as the Carrefour or whatever.
It's not, but it kind of is.
Yeah,
it's kind of they're sort of revolting cousins.
Yes, they are. Yeah, that's fascinating. So what happened then beyond that? I mean, we kind of move into the sort of mid to late 80s, and then into the period that kind of is often thought of by horror lovers as one of the worst eras of horror, into the 90s. What became of zombies during this time?
I think what happened is, and I'm not disparaging these films, but things like Return of the Living Dead, Evil Dead 2, Brain Dead, Death Becomes Her, they started to take the mickey out of zombies. And usually that's the beginning of the end. That's the death knell. As soon as they start satirising a genre, it's kind of done. Look what happened to the Universal horror films. They met Abbott and Costello,
right? Exactly.
And it kind of started to fall apart. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what happened, is that they became a bit of a joke. Zombies. I think they'd done everything they could at that point. Yeah. We'd had the zombie apocalypse, and we've seen that in Dawn and Day of the Dead. Yeah. We'd sort of reached the limit of the apocalypse in Day, where there was just no way back. Yes. There was nowhere else to go after Day. There was nowhere to take it. Yeah. They had to start sending it out. They had to start spoofing it. Yeah. And while at first that was really good, I love Return of the Living Dead. It's a very stupid film. I absolutely adore it. It's great fun. Yeah. Wonderful. Brain Dead. What a great film. Just makes me laugh even just saying the title. Amazing. Brain Dead. Death Becomes Her. Very, very, very funny film.
And again, these are movies you think of as being like, they've got lots of fun gore in them. Body horror,
right.
And that's it.
And that's it. Yeah. And I think that was the problem, that they became kind of commonplace. Yes. They became a bit too... It was waiting for someone to come along and say, actually, we can do something with zombies again.
Yes.
We can go back to the Romero style and we can actually sort of do something serious with them.
Yeah, again, very similar. I keep drawing comparisons, but very similar to the slashers, isn't it? And what happened to the slashers by the late 80s, when we were getting Friday the 13th 8 and 9 and 10 and, Freddy going into video games and things and cartoons. And then it needed somebody to go, let's try something new.
Let's try and do something different.
Scary again with slashers,
Yeah, exactly.
And it's exactly what happened, isn't it? So then we get 28 Days Later in 2002.
Of course.
The animals are contagious. The infection is in their blood and saliva. One bite. Stop! You've no idea!
And the timing of that could not have been better.
Yeah.
I say better. I mean, that's probably a crass thing to say, but I mean, it was post 9/11.
Yes.
The world had changed beyond all recognition. There is that again, it's another dividing line. 9/11 is a dividing line. The world before 9/11 and the world after, two different places. And 28 days later, whether by design or by accident, really tapped into that. They really caught something that was in the air. And like I said earlier, there was the SARS outbreak in South China, which happened in 2002, the same year that it came out.
Yeah.
That really fed into this idea that we're all going to die of an infection.
Yeah.
And here's this film which is saying, yes, you're going to die of this infection. The interesting thing, of course, is they're not zombies.
No, and there's always arguments
and there's always arguments about this. You know, the purists will say, no.
Of course.
And I would say, if it looks like a zombie and it moves like a zombie, it probably is.
Yes.
I think.
Although, does it move like a zombie because they run?
Well, here's an interesting thought.
Yeah,
I was watching Night of the Living Dead over the weekend, and I'd completely forgotten just how quick that graveyard zombie is at the beginning. Bill
when
Hintzman.
he comes after the car and everything.
He gets a bit of a turn of speed going, doesn't he? In Dawn of the Dead, when they smell blood, they can break into a little bit of a trot, so they get going. This sort of fast-moving zombie has been there all the time, really. I think rather cleverly in the Romero films, even in the crappy second lot, that he does actually show a development of the zombies, that they start slowing down and then they start to pick up some intelligence and move on. And I think that it was right to have the fast-moving zombies.
Yes.
I think it was right. As I said earlier, you know, I'm not the fittest man in the world, but I could outwalk most of them. It got to the point when I just wasn't scared of them anymore.
I think that's it.
Return of the Living Dead, they're quite quick-moving in Return of the Living Dead, aren't they?
That's true. Yeah. That's true.
And I think once you'd got past this idea that there were thousands, possibly millions of them, that was their scary selling point.
Exactly.
You can still outwalk them.
Yes.
And I think they needed to have that sort of jolt of being fast moving. That it doesn't matter what you're doing, they're going to get you anyway, because you can run as fast as you like, they're still coming after you. And because they're sort of so obsessed with catching you, they're not going to stop.
And everything about the movie felt so, like you said, Fulci's movies always everything moved quite slowly. Yes. Everything about Danny Boyle's direction is quick and immediate and handheld and jerky and jarring.
It's over before you know it.
Yes,
it's like, oh my God, the end titles are started. It's a really fast-paced film, and perfectly so. Yeah. Perfectly so, I think. It hits the ground running and never lets up to the last second.
No,
you know?
And it is terror. It is a terrifying movie.
Oh, really scary.
Really scary.
And again, as you said earlier, the real horror isn't the infected.
It's what happens.
It's those lunatic soldiers, isn't it? They're the real horror.
Yeah.
You know, if they'd all pulled together and not been arseholes, you could have stayed in that place and it would have been fine. You'd have survived perfectly well.
Yeah.
But they're human beings.
Yes.
And because they're human beings, they're deeply unpleasant people.
Exactly.
The infected, we understand the infected.
Yes.
Because they just want to make more infected and they want to have a bite out of you. And that's, because they're hungry.
Yes.
We understand that. Human beings are horrible. You know, and that's the message of that film, I think. That,
and that is why I think whether or not you call it a purist zombie movie, they're not zombies necessarily, but it is a zombie movie.
Oh,
it
absolutely.
There's this apocalyptic kind of end of the world storyline, a bunch of people banding together in a kind of fort-like kind of location.
That's right.
Horrible humans doing horrible things to each other and screwing each other over. Often men to women, or to there was that feeling in Day of the Dead, wasn't there? A kind of real kind of machismo kind of toxic masculinity.
It was, and so the sensible ones were the women and the two guys who just basically wanted to get pissed most of the day. They just wanted to get pissed and have a good time, have a chat and what the rest of it.
Yes.
It was the macho blockheads with guns that were the problem. And I think, again, that in 28 Days Later, that's exactly what that is. It's the macho blockheads with guns,
Yes.
So this is a film that stopped taking the piss out of zombies and said, actually, they could be seen as a metaphor again. We're going to use them as a metaphor, and we're going to use them as an entry point to exploring some facet of human behaviour. And that's what the truly great zombie films do, I think.
Yeah, agreed. It's wonderful. And then it feels like shortly after that, we had which we're still kind of in the middle of this like boom of zombie movies. We're everywhere again, weren't they?
They're everywhere, absolutely. I mean, it's probably unfair to put the blame on poor old 28 Days Later, it's I mean, after that they were literally everywhere. There were all, I mean, we even got the Dawn of the Dead remake.
Yes.
We got, I've lost track of how many Day of the Dead 2s there are now. There seem to be dozens of those
There's
knocking
another
about.
one really recently.
There
wasn't
was, yeah. I mean, they seem to, every time I sort of go online, there's another another Day of the Dead. We're now, I mean, just as we're talking, just a few weeks ago, it was announced that there's going to be a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. I thought that was Dawn of the Dead, to be honest, but clearly I was wrong.
Very
but
odd,
yeah, so they are everywhere. And in fact, it's interesting that the zombies have now become so ingrained in our culture in a way that other monsters probably haven't.
Absolutely.
The very day that you contacted me to say, do you want to come and do this, I came down here to the South Bank, and for people outside London who don't know, there's quite often a bookstall outside on the South Bank. And I was coming down here to meet someone. I was a bit early, went to the bookstore, and the very first thing I saw was a children's book called My Big Fat Zombie Goldfish.
There you go.
And I thought... You know, preschool kids now know what zombies are. They are everywhere.
Oh, totally. My where I come from down in Kent, in Folkestone, my nephew, who's like 9 or 10, took part in this thing that the whole town did, which was a zombie walk, where you all dress up in face paint and makeup and you all walk down the high street together as zombies. I mean, it's very odd.
In some ways, this is quite a good thing. In some ways, I wonder if we're getting back to that point in the 90s where no one's taking them seriously anymore.
Yes, I think that is.
We can go out and do a zombie walk because they're safe.
Yeah. Well, you've got massively, and I think there's also a video game link as well. I think there's something video gamey about zombie movies, isn't there?
Yes, that's a survival thing, isn't it?
It's that survival. It's like find a good, point on the top of a building and pick them off with a gun or whatever.
Exactly.
And there's get Plants versus Zombies that kids play on the iPad or whatever.
Exactly.
They're everywhere. Resident Evil. There's I think there's a big kind of all ages now.
Are we in danger of sanitising the zombie?
I think we are.
I think that's quite worrying, because I'm hoping there's somebody out there, hoping there's a new Danny Boyle, there's a new Lucio Fulci, there's a new George Romero, who's just sort of biding their time.
Yes.
And we do still see them. Train to Busan came out a couple of years ago. Extraordinary film.
Yeah.
That's great. So there are people still out there making the proper, serious zombie films.
Definitely.
But I do feel like there's a whole wave of them now which aren't taking it seriously.
Yes.
And it's kind of, we're back to where we were in the 90s again.
I think we are. I think we've reached peak zombie fatigue, I think.
Oh, I think so.
I think you can...
and actually sounds like one of the diseases you might get in a film. There's an outbreak of peak zombie
fatigue. I love it. That's true. I think The Walking Dead has absolutely run itself into the ground.
I think you did that quite a while ago, actually, to be honest.
I think we're all in agreement about this, probably most of us at least. There must still be people that watch it, but most people I speak to, Walking Dead, they go, oh yeah, I stopped that around series 3 or 4, it is...
ran out of steam worryingly quickly, I thought.
It did. It was promising at the beginning, but it felt like it didn't know where to go with it, and that's the problem with zombies, is that they just wander.
If you haven't got the intellect of a George Romero or a David Cronenberg, your zombies will just meander about looking for something to bite.
Exactly.
It takes someone of the intelligence of Romero to say, they're going to wander about having a bite, but there's a reason why they're doing it.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why.
Yeah.
And it sounds horrible to say it about sort of current filmmakers, but I can't think of anybody that's got that level of intellect. To pull that off at the moment. I think,
but I will say one of the best recent ones, which we were talking about before we started, is Pontypool, isn't it? From it's 2011, is it? And it is. That is again not technically zombies, but it's absolutely a zombie film, but just a brilliantly original one, isn't it?
They're conversationalists.
Yeah, conversationalists.
Which I love as an idea. Pontypool is magnificent. It's a film that could only be made in Canada. I won't spoil it. You watch the film, you'll find out why it could only be made in Canada.
Mrs. French's cat is missing. The signs are posted all over town. Have you seen Honey? We've all seen the posters, but nobody has seen Honey the cat. Nobody. Until last Thursday morning, when Miss Colette Piscine swerved her car to miss Honey the cat as she drove across a bridge. Well, this bridge, now slightly damaged, is a bit of a local treasure and even has its own fancy name, Pont de Flac. Now, Colette, that sounds like culotte. That's panty in French. And piscine means pool, panty pool. Flac also means pool in French, so Colette Piscine in French panty pool drives over the Pont de Flac, the Pontypool, if you will, to avoid hitting Mrs. French's cat that has been missing in Pontypool. 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 Pantypool. Pont de Flac. What does it mean?
But yeah, that's another one which is just like this incredibly intelligent take. It gives a whole new slant on the transmission of the virus, which is just mind-blowing when you actually come across it. You have to stop the film and actually have a think about it, because it's so
I wonder if that's the problem with the reason why not enough people have seen the film, or not enough people have appreciated it. It's almost too clever, that film. Almost alienatingly so sometimes for some audiences.
I think it's better than we deserve sometimes. It is such incredible. A clever film. It is, and brilliant performances. There's really only three main characters. We get a couple of other people wandering out, but three main characters, all of them stunningly good performances, to the point where one of them doesn't survive, we do feel genuinely shocked that they're no longer with us.
Yes.
And it is such a clever film, but like you say, yes, I think it is. It's almost too clever, which is not a criticism, because nothing can ever be too clever in my book. I think, you 10 out of 10 for trying, and 10 out of 10 for succeeding in my book, because I think it's a magnificent film. Again, if you haven't seen Pontypool, please stop listening to us, because we're just going to drone on for a little while.
We won't spoil anything about it,
just
but
go and watch it.
It's wonderful.
It's magnificent.
It is wonderful. And that, to me, was one of the last zombie movies, quote unquote, that kind of did something new. Because I think Train to Busan is brilliant, but it's just a solid zombie film.
It's a zombie apocalypse film, isn't it? Yes. It's everything World War Z wanted to be, basically. It is that kind of fairly big budget action zombie film.
Yes.
Brilliantly. Whereas World War Z wasn't brilliantly done, this was brilliantly done.
Exactly.
And it is magnificent. It adds a little bit of sort of it's one of the few zombie films you'll probably end up crying at the end.
Oh my
There's
God,
not many zombie films you say that to. But I mean, it is a very moving film.
Yes.
But it's, it is a standard zombie apocalypse film, just brilliantly done.
Yes,
just brilliantly
exactly,
done.
just solidly made.
But Pontypool was probably the last time we saw something completely new.
Where you think, this is like a 28 Days Later, like, this is maybe nudging the genre in a new direction.
Sadly, it didn't.
It didn't.
But what we do get, and I think it's kind of interesting, is I think filmmakers now are sort of looking at what's gone before, taking it for granted, and doing sort of remixes of what goes on. I'm thinking of the film that was at the London Film Festival last year called The Cured, which was an Irish film about what happens after the zombie apocalypse, what happens when we cure the zombies. They come back into society and meet prejudice and so on. And this was an Irish film, so there's an awful lot of undercurrents of the troubles and the intolerance and prejudice that went on there. So it's nothing new, because it's just a zombie apocalypse, but it kind of is. It's kind of a different twist on it. And there was a fabulous, almost forgotten, sadly, BBC Three TV series in 2013 called In the Flesh.
That's right,
which is very similar. It was all about what happens when the zombies are cured and the prejudice that they meet coming back into society. So these things do still happen, but they're kind of taking things we've seen before and putting a twist on them.
Yes.
We're not getting another Night of the Living Dead.
No, we're not. No.
And I can't foresee getting another Night of the Living Dead. You know what I mean?
No. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if there are any, more, if we're talking turbulent times, I mean, there's no better time right now, is there, than to make some apocalyptic zombie movie.
Yeah. I mean, the crowd, the people, sort of believing.
Yes.
People believe whatever they're told these days.
Mindless
slave.
Yes.
And exactly. And you'd think now, where's George when we need him? Can't he come back?
Exactly.
I mean, come on, you did it enough times in the film, George. Come back, man. We need you.
I know.
But we need someone of that intellect. We need David Cronenberg to do a zombie film. We really do, because it's that kind of rigorous intellect that would actually not save the genre, because it's not dead, but it would reinvigorate it again.
I think it does need a little reinvigoration.
It needs a kick up the bum, doesn't it?
It does need a bit of a kick up the bum, because it's like we said at the very beginning, it's an easy, quick film to make. Maybe a zombie film. That's the problem.
Too easy, I think, is the problem.
Yeah.
And we still do get the sort of the Train to Busan, but they're rarities now. And I think back in the late 70s, early 80s, there were good zombie films turning up all over.
Yes.
Whereas now you have to wade through an awful lot of at best mediocre zombie films to get to the real gems.
Exactly.
But they're there to be found. Sort of Train to Busan, The Cured. Go and watch those. They're wonderful films.
The Girl with All the Gifts is again an interesting new slant on zombies that maybe just didn't do as well as maybe it should have.
Well, I think that's more, to be honest, of a science fiction film than horror. And there is this crossover. We talked earlier about how sort of zombies became more science fiction post Romero. And I think that's almost classic science fiction in the sense that what it's doing is saying the world has changed and this is what's coming next.
Yes.
You know, in the zombie apocalypse films, it just tends to be there's lots of zombies about and people have guns, they blow them away, and that's that. And almost the status quo is almost restored.
Yes.
In Girl with All the Gifts, and again, not wishing to give too much away, at the end, there is no way back.
No.
This is a whole new world that's been born right in front of our eyes.
Yes.
And it's a very exciting new world in a way, frightening but exciting.
Yeah.
I am producing a vaccine, and she is the main ingredient.
What am I?
Hope. That's what you are.
I just want to live. Everyone wants that.
She loves you. The hell is this?
The world is falling apart. You can save people, Melanie. You can save everybody. Oh my God.
Zombie films are everywhere. We have to do that little bit of extra work to find the good ones.
That's exactly it, isn't it? Yeah. You've got to wade through the sea of...
But they're not going away. They're not going away because the metaphors will always be there.
Yeah.
And, there's always going to be something to say.
And actually, even if there isn't, there's always an audience of people that just want to watch some schlocky heads being lopped off and eyes being gouged out.
And to be honest, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes that's, sometimes on a Friday night after a long week at work, that's all you need. You just need to see some heads being ripped off. It would be nice if we could have that and
exactly,
you know what I mean?
Brains.
Yeah, just have.
I feel like there's a joke to be made here, and zombies just want brains. That's what they need.
Exactly, exactly right. Yeah, send more brains.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what we need.
Yes, amazing. Well, there you go. Well, Kev, thank you so much. We whizzed through the entire history of the zombie genre there. I loved it. That was good fun. Kev, where can people find stuff you've written and find more info about you and that kind of thing?
Well,
online?
I got my websites.
Yes.
As I say every single time on this, it's a bit of a mouthful. The Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television. EOFFTV.com.
Brilliant.
I have a reviews website called the EOFFTV Review.
Yeah.
That's a WordPress site. I can never remember the full address. Just type in EOFFTV Review.
Yeah.
New reviews go up every day. You'll find all sorts of rubbish on there.
Any zombie stuff on there? Any zombie?
Oh yes, lots of zombie stuff. Yeah. Be warned, there is a Dawn of the Dead review. Brace yourselves. But yeah, I'm on Twitter. I mean, EOFFTV on Twitter. I'm on Facebook.
Lovely.
Come and say hello. I'm not as grumpy as I appear sometimes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Come and tell me why Dawn of the Dead is better than I think it
exactly. Let's have it out online. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A big thank you there to the fantastic Kevin Lyons. But we're not finished yet. It's time to introduce another two guests and carry on talking about zombies a little longer. This time from a little bit more of an academic perspective. The zombie subgenre, as I'm sure many of you know, it's a particularly interesting one to talk about, not just from a psychoanalytic perspective, but also from a sociological one. So I thought, what better time to be joined by two brilliant cinephiles who also happen to be experts in these areas. So I'll introduce them both. Firstly, somebody who has been on the podcast a whole bunch of times. She's always here with me every series, discussing horror from her own unique Freudian perspective. She now also co-hosts the brilliant Projections podcast. It is my great pleasure to welcome back Mary Wilde. Hello, Mary.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. As we were just discussing, I'm really loving your podcast, the Projections podcast.
Thank you so much.
For anyone listening who doesn't know anything about it yet, tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so this is one that I co-host with my friend Sarah Cleaver. It's called Projections. You can find us on iTunes. And it's really kind of like converting my lecture series Projections, which I run at the Freud Museum, in a podcast format. So we mainly just discuss films from a psychoanalytic perspective. We run a series. We've just finished one on mental illness in cinema.
Yeah.
And we also upload minisodes, so reviews of films. And it's really always kind of trying to capture the dimension of psychology and the psyche and the mind in films that we watch.
And plenty for like listeners to this, like horror fans to enjoy in this podcast. podcast as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Amazing. And welcoming for the first time to the podcast, Tim Coleman. Hello, Tim.
Hello, mate.
How are you, first of all?
Yeah, I'm good.
Thank you for coming all the way down. You're from the sticks, aren't you?
You're from the Midlands, from Coventry. Yeah.
For people who don't know anything about you, just tell me a little bit about yourself and sort of what you do, what your background is.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a freelance film critic for Total Film magazine.
Very cool.
I'm a screenwriter, so I got into recently the final round of the New Blood competition with Fright Fest and Queensbury Pictures.
Congrats, that's awesome.
Yeah, thanks, man. So I'm kind of writing my first horror feature off the back of that. And,
is there anything you can tell us about it?
So I don't know how much I can tell you.
Yeah, okay.
But I can say, I mean, it's folk horror, so... my day job at the moment is I'm a social worker working with asylum seekers, and so I'm kind of drawing on some of the folkloric traditions of Middle Eastern cultures and trying to use that to talk about personal and national trauma. So that's kind of where I'm going with it.
You do a lot of stuff. Like, you must be so busy because you're doing all kinds of things with your career. You're doing this. You write for Total Film. Yeah, how do you squeeze it all in?
Yeah, I probably don't sleep enough. It's probably the answer. Like, you know, like last night I was up till like 1 kind of reading, and you know, but you know,
it's all stuff you love doing, I suppose.
That's it. I mean, if you kind of, it's the old, I think
You're passionate.
That's it, man. Yeah, it's like, isn't it the Confucius quote, like, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And so I'm one of those really annoying people that I have like multiple jobs and I love them all. So I'm happy to give my time to that. And obviously my family, I've got young kids as well.
Oh my God. Well, congrats. Amazing.
Thanks, man.
Absolutely amazing. So I thought you guys would both be really good to we could all chat together about this, because I think, you know, zombies are an interesting subgenre to talk about from a kind of psychoanalytic perspective, but also from this kind of more sociological side as well. So we can sort of go through a few points together. Just Mary, first of all, just from your perspective, what do you find kind of interesting about the subgenre, would you say?
I love zombie movies.
Do you?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. There's so much to talk about, really.
Yeah.
What I love is that there are so many psychoanalytic concepts that come through in the genre or the subgenre. It's that kind of familiar aspect of humanity that's now detached.
Yes.
I love seeing the manifestation of Freud's theory of the repetition compulsion, because when you're watching a zombie film, it's kind of like mesmerizing because there's so much repetitive content. There's so many scenes of hordes of people, you know, hordes of the undead following an individual, kind of like mindlessly following each other.
Yes.
And it's also got that kind of a dimension of the abject, which interests me.
Yes, definitely, which we'll get into in more depth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess that's it. There's a lot of shades to it, and I think more than what meets the eye. I think, you know, like me and Kevin were talking about to him, like this idea that maybe the zombie genre, a little bit like slashers and those kind of more splattery movies, are often looked down upon. But there's quite a lot of stuff to, pardon the pun, chew over. There's going to be a lot of that with this subgenre, isn't there? I mean, do you think that from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I would agree with Mary, like zombies is one of my favorite subgenres, probably up there with body horror, you know, and zombies, you could argue there's a lot of connective tissue with body horror.
Yes.
But I think what it achieves is you get the catharsis of the splattery violence, which is one of the main draws, I think, of slasher movies and zombie films.
Yes.
But with zombies, you have the added dimension that almost from its inception, it's a genre that's tooled up to talk about sociological issues and to reflect back very explicitly a lot of the anxieties that we bring. And I mean, obviously that's true about horror in general. Like if you look at horror films down the ages, they tend to reflect the anxieties and the social neuroses of people and the issues of the day. And certainly, you know, if I were to look at my top 5 horror films, like the majority of them have that dimension, even if there are other subgenres. But yeah, zombies in particular are, I think, almost custom built to talk about those kind of broader socio-political issues in a way that maybe slashers, for instance, isn't.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because zombies are basically kind of, there's not much to them. They're kind of blank slates, aren't they? And I guess, you know, is that part of what makes them such a kind of, I don't know, sort of malleable subgenre or something, do you think?
Yeah, they're almost like the ideal analysts, because they're so, as we were discussing before, because they don't actually present with sort of expression and communication. They sort of just repeat behavior constantly, and in a way they're predictable on that level.
Yes.
We then the characters in the films, but also we, the viewers, we project our own anxieties onto them, and they're almost the perfect screening device to kind of reflect back to us our deepest fears.
Yes.
And so because of that, in a sense, it's kind of like it's a perfect formula, because for filmmakers, it's the zombie trope, or the kind of the iconic dimensions of it. It seems so simple, but actually it's really a mirror.
Yeah.
It's always reflecting back the viewer and the characters in the film.
Totally. I think that what the best zombie films do is actually don't really focus much on the zombies. It's like The Walking Dead, isn't it? It's that, it's not really about the zombies at all. It's about what how these humans cope in crisis a lot of the time, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
How awful human beings are to each other in times of crisis is usually what, especially the Romero ones, are about, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, taking what Mary said as well, there's that kind of personal dimension of it, like reflecting back an individual, but also the kind of communal dimension of it being a broader thing. So, you could locate the latter zombie movies, but certainly post Night of the Living Dead, as being part of an apocalyptic subgenre as well as being a subgenre of horror. And I think part of what that subgenre deals with is that sense of burning civilization down to the ground as a way of then critiquing it and thinking about what stuff should go, what stuff causes us social anxiety. And so there is that kind of, I think that's one of the other strengths about it, is it's both macro and micro in terms of how it analyzes people's fears.
Definitely. And it's interesting because I think a lot of horror fans know that about, Night of the Living Dead, that I think it's famous for having this kind of subtext and all kinds of kind of interesting social elements and commentaries going on. But what about, I just want to touch briefly on the early zombie films that came before that, and these kind of sort of Haitian, Caribbean, voodoo zombies that weren't really sort of, corpses coming back to life necessarily, but more just kind of people. Or were they? Yeah. I mean, and do you think that those kind of early zombies still have similar tropes or, things to discuss and chew over in the same way that Romero's did?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think what's fascinating about those early films, and actually pre-cinema, the kind of folkloric traditions from the Caribbean, is the way those social issues are baked into it. And so kind of, if you want to rewind several hundred years, just very briefly, the imperial advances of countries like France and England, when they were then colonizing and enslaving African nations and then moving people groups over to the Caribbean to work in the coffee and sugar plantations, they brought, as well as the people, they kind of brought up a diverse collection of religious and spiritual beliefs. And they all kind of got mixed up into a melting pot in the Caribbean, and that then in turn gets mixed up with the Christianity of the slavers. And so what you end up is this kind of syncretic, blended kind of religion, which is what voodoo is. And because the zombie exists as a folkloric part of voodoo, the issue right from its inception, right from the time that Westerners encounter in the late Victorian period, is bound up in ideas of colonialism, bound up in ideas of racial othering, dehumanization, capitalism, and critiquing those things as well. And so, the first time that the word zombie kind of enters Western consciousness is in the late 19th century. You get like travel writers like William Seabrook and Lafcadio Hearn, and there seemed to be a little bit of uncertainty about what a zombie was. There's like a really amusing there's a really amusing account of Hearn in particular trying to pin down locals about what a zombie is, and he's getting this very contradictory account, like including an account that it's a horse that walks past you at night with 3 legs, and it's kind of uncanny but imprecise. And then Seabrook is doing his own kind of ethnographic studies, and he comes across somebody who says, I'll show you zombies, and he sees these dead men working in the fields, and that actually ends up being a direct influence on White Zombie as the first cinematic zombie. And so what's interesting then is when you get White Zombie made, it's drawing on that history of all those kind of socio-political issues. And so, I would just say there is so much then that is rooted from day one in that kind of deconstructing and analysing those big socio-political issues that Romero, of course, does it in a different way. And he kind of... I think you could say made the first zombie film in the way that we think of them often. Yeah. But certainly, prior to that, it was
still there.
Absolutely. I think it's not baked into the literature in the same way. So like vampires have a literary tradition, but zombies come almost directly from those kind of folkloric roots. that grew up in the Caribbean.
Yeah, there is a kind of almost folk horror-y feel, kind of adjacent thing, isn't there, I think, as well, that idea of kind of, if you're a zombie, especially those old zombies, you lose your identity, you lose your control, you're brainwashed or something. I mean, do you think that's what do you think is it that we fear in zombies, would you say, Mary? Is it something along those lines?
Actually, I was thinking, just as you were speaking, actually, that there's this, I don't know if you're familiar with the phenomenon of catatonia. So that being, it refers to a psychomotor immobility, and behavioral abnormalities. So, and this is something that often gets portrayed in films depicting mental illness.
Yeah.
So, for example, people holding rigid poses, the inability to speak, something called waxy flexibility, which is the individual maintains positions after being placed in them by someone else. And catatonia also relates to bizarre, non-goal directed hyperactivity and impulsiveness. And the Scottish psychiatrist, R.D. Lang, he highlighted the link between social expectations and compulsion in the context of schizophrenia. And he suggested that the schizogenesis may account for some of the aspects of zombification, particularly relating to the catatonic state.
Yes.
So there's, in other words, through the physical appearance of zombies, we get an insight into what might be going on at the kind of on the psychological layer.
Yeah.
And so, and actually also there's, are you familiar with Roland Littlewood? I came across him. He's a professor of anthropology and psychiatry, and he published a study reporting on the social explanation of the zombie phenomenon. In the medical journal The Lancet, and this was published in 1997. And the social explanation sees observed cases of people identified as zombies as a culture-bound syndrome.
Right.
With a particular cultural form of adoption practice in Haiti that unites the homeless and mentally ill with grieving families who see them as the returned lost ones. And he said, although there's no single explanation for all cases where zombies are recognized by locals in Haiti, the mistaken identification of a wandering mentally ill stranger by bereaved relatives is the most likely explanation in many cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So it kind of plays on those ideas that there's these, people that you might recognize.
Yes.
It might be some residue of someone you once knew and they were disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think kind of drawing on that, it's fascinating to look at the explanations for zombies, that they kind of exist in not only in this kind of liminal state between being alive and being dead, but also the explanations being supernatural or medical.
Exactly.
Yes.
So kind of there was the writer Wade Davis who kind of looked at the causes for zombification and came across this idea that although there was witchcraft involved, there was poison drawn out of the puffer fish mixed with broken glass and a bunch of witchy kind of rituals on it. They put it on your doorstep and you walk out your doorstep, cut your feet, get poisoned, and then zombification is a toxicological response to that. And so I think, it's fascinating then to think of it as something which is medically, it can be explained. But also, it kind of goes to show then how the flexibility of the zombie to reflect different things, again, is right there from the very beginning. It's like, it's not concrete, the dead have rise to life. It's like, are they alive? Are they dead? We can't quite say. Is it supernatural? Is it medical? We can't quite say. And that breadth of explanations gives us such a, I think it kind of contributes to the endurability of the zombie, because it means it is so malleable and porous in terms of what kind of meanings we want to read into it and reflect back from.
Yeah. Totally. I think if you look at those classic horror monsters, you know that a vampire is very much a kind of supernatural thing. A ghost is, Frankenstein's monster was much more about science gone wrong or whatever. But with zombie, like you say, it can be both. There's this whole history of zombie being like supernatural voodoo witchcraft, but it could also be science, infection, illness, disease, 28 Days Later type thing as well. And like you say, it's kind of right there from the origins in a way. And I thought Kevin Lyons said something interesting that, a lot of horror zombie movies these days are about the body, but back then they were more about the soul. And it feels like there's this, it's kind of the mind, the body and the soul. A zombie can kind of deal with all three in a way, can't they? And the sort of the control of them in different ways, or loss of control of them. Yeah. Really interesting. And then so when we get to sort of Night of the Living Dead, then obviously we're going to talk about this movie in great depth, I'm sure, over the next few weeks. But what kind of changed then, Tim, from your perspective in terms of how big an impact that film made and everything?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you can say about that film. Yes. Of course, it's absolutely seminal in the history of horror. I think taking a sociological perspective on it, I would say you got to look at when it was made. So it was made in 1968, and the optimism of the early 1960s, it had soured. Yes. Prior to that, a lot of horror had been in the kind of Hammer and Universal traditions of gothic monsters, maybe with a literary heritage. And then in the 1960s, you've got great social upheaval in the States. So you've had JFK was assassinated in 1963. You've got the ongoing civil rights marches, and people trying to break down segregation. And you've got the Vietnam War, which is rumbling along, so that by 1968 had already been going on for 13 years. And so you have George Romero, John Russo, and their other collaborators, part of the Image 10 group, are these 20-something kind of pot-smoking hippies, highly politicized, highly engaged, or aware of the kind of political turmoil of their time. And what they end up doing is then making a grindhouse film, which then reflects those social anxieties back. And so I would say you can't necessarily give a strict allegorical reading of that film saying this means, like, for instance, some people have said the zombies represent the silent majority who voted Nixon into power in, I think, 1969. I think that's a little bit reductive, because I think actually, like best zombie films, there's a complexity and nuance and flexibility in that. But certainly it is reflecting back this idea that American society is turning in on itself, it's eating itself. You've got the young protesting, you've got the old conservatives kind of coming against them. And there's that sense of social breakdown in America, which then Romero and Russo and the others kind of channel into their movie. I think the other thing I'd say cinematically is it is one of those, maybe the first film, I struggle to think of another one that early, that kind of bridged the gap between grindhouse and art house. And there's like fascinating accounts of, although it maybe started off in like the drive-ins and that kind of thing, that Andy Warhol and other kind of artistic luminaries of the day got hold of it, championed it. Some guys from Europe did, like people like Argento were a big fan, and that kind of then pushed it back into if you like more artistic credibility. And so even if they didn't intend to make a work of high art, they kind of did.
Yeah.
So.
It's crazy, Mary, as well, to think that film was the first one, or at least one of the first, where the zombies were eating flesh as well. This was, at the time, a kind of new thing, almost a twist, a reveal midway through Night of the Living Dead. It's like, oh my God, they're actually not just killing us, they're eating us. What's the kind of importance of... We all think of now zombies as being flesh eaters, don't we, I suppose? What's the kind of relevance of that, would you say, or the importance of that to the zombie?
Well, I have a theory that the zombie trope, on some level, acts as a cinematic representation of depression.
Oh, okay.
And this brings me to actually mention a paper by Freud, Mourning and Melancholia. So in this paper, Freud is making the distinction between mourning, i.e. grieving, which is a conscious response to a physical loss or someone's, a beloved person's death, and melancholia, which is an unconscious response to something abstract that's been lost. You can't quite pin it down. And melancholia stands in here for depression. And actually, in that paper, there's so much in the way that Freud, discusses these two modes of being that actually lends itself very well to the horror film genre, like the horror genre in general. He's talking here about basically in an advanced society, there's an overabundance and overexposure to the pleasure principle. So we're constantly bombarded with even expectations to be happy, which, by the way, for Freud was not really a meaningful goal. He didn't really care too much about increasing people's happiness. He actually said it's more important to find meaning. And he said that with all this overexposure to the pleasure principle and everything being so much more available, actually depression rates are rising. People complain more,
right? Yeah.
Because in a way through that overexposure and surplus, they've kind of become deadened to it. They've become deadened to experiencing pleasure. It almost becomes unattainable. And he describes melancholia as an open wound that won't really close up, a kind of emptying and hollowing out of the conscious personality, of the ego, until it becomes totally impoverished. And he says there's no interest in the outside world. The ego becomes entirely absorbed in sadness. And crucially, this is where it comes to the flesh eating. He talks about in his paper that there's a regression in the melancholic individual to the oral stage of psychosexual development, which Freud even compares to cannibalism in a theoretical way. And he said, quote, "The ego wants to incorporate the lost object into itself by devouring it." End quote. And I think this is where the flesh-eating dimension in the zombie subgenre becomes theoretically interesting.
Yeah.
Pointing to this desire by the depressed subject to bring back what they've lost into themselves by gorging on it. A good example of this is in The Return of the Living Dead.
Yes.
Dan O'Bannon's film. I love this film.
What a film.
I know.
Amazing.
I swear this film has not aged at all.
No.
It's so entertaining.
But also
brilliant.
it's so 80s as well.
I know,
But I know what you mean. It still looks
relevant.
incredible.
It's still relevant. Yeah. And in this film, they capture a zombie, and she says that death is painful, and the only thing that is comforting is eating brains. So, the zombie kind of presents as kind of like a depressed subject, this kind of anguished, distressed, sad, melancholic subject, or undead, entity.
Yes.
And they long to reintegrate them, into themselves what they have lost, their agency and autonomy of the mind, which is here standing in as the brain.
You're so right. And I think jumping forward slightly, I think that is happening a lot in a lot of more comedic maybe zombie films like Shaun of the Dead and that kind of thing. Tim, there's this idea that now we're all wandering around on our phones kind of lifelessly. I feel like there's been a lot of comparisons made recently to that, hasn't there? That we're becoming more and more kind of zombified with modern day life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real thematic thread for a lot of zombie films that they start off as these abject others that need to be crushed and destroyed, and eventually as they kind of gain more traction and they outnumber the living, actually they become the dominant society.
Yes.
And so it's like the next step of human development. They are post-human, if you like. And so you see that in movies like The Girl with All the Gifts.
Even sort of Day of the Dead introduced that with Bub and everything, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Day of the Dead, for the record, is my favourite Romero, I think.
High five to that.
Absolutely. Me too.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Because, I feel like,
I know, it feels like a kind of dirty kind of confession. We're in a safe space here, literally.
Full
We're
disclosure.
in a room called Safe Space. No, it's true. It's brilliant, isn't it? Day of the Dead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the current political landscape being what it is, it's still. You talked before about films that still remain prescient, like with Return of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
I think you could argue Night, yes, but everything from Dawn down is particularly because we have a increasingly isolationist political landscape. We have a president in the White House who is kind of embodies 80s, capitalism.
Right. Yeah.
So the idea of, hey, maybe it'd be better if we just had undead ghouls, just burn it to the ground, we can start again.
Yes.
That's, I think, something that speaks to the current social malaise that we have, here in UK, but of course, like transnationally.
Yeah, because I guess there's something quite kind of nihilistic about zombies, even the fun ones. It's not like there's never a happy ending. Maybe some of the main characters survive, but they never win over the zombies. It's still like they're living with zombies by the end. It's not like the monster is never defeated in a sense, because the monster isn't just a vampire or a ghoul or something. It's like, no, this is a new world now, sort of thing, isn't it?
I'm sure Mary's going to say this anyway, but like for me, that's goes down to the micro level, is that zombies on a very basic level represent death, because they are the dead. They literally get up and they come at you, and you can probably outrun them for a little bit if they're the slow ones. But eventually they're going to get you, and that's not to be too morbid, that's like everybody. That's death is coming down the line, and you can take that in a kind of depressive way, or you can take it in a, okay, well, what am I going to do then with the time I've got? And there's a sense of optimism and control over what future you do have. So that element of, if you like, kind of philosophical consideration of mortality is present there as well.
Yeah, if I may just expand on that, because obviously, yes, absolutely, the idea of the death drive is a big thing in psychoanalysis, and for Freud, this was that kind of unconscious impulse toward aggression, but also maybe sadism towards yourself or other people, self-sabotaging, the opposite of what you might do to enhance yourself, like the erotic aspect of life in terms of pursuing pleasurable things, improving yourself, harmonizing with other people. The death drive is the kind of photographic negative of that. But it's also this unconscious desire to return to the inorganic state. That's how Freud phrased it. This idea that on some level, we want to destroy ourselves. And in some people, it might be more rampant. And this, of course, manifests in so many different ways. But for the zombie thing, I think I definitely agree with what you said about the kind of existential element of death and how that presents in the zombie subgenre, this fear of death that motivates us to overcome it by denying its fatality and its final destiny. But just to kind of add one other element to this, I want to bring what Slavoj Žižek said about the death drive, because he said that he actually kind of, in a sense, departed from Freud here. He said the death drive has actually very little to do with the desire for self-destruction. He said it is the very opposite of dying. It's a name for the undead eternal life, for the horrible fate of being caught in the endless repetitive cycle of wandering around in guilt and pain. That's zombies. Because their whole suffering is that there is no end. They're just stuck in this place. They're in a limbo, purgatorial state where it's like they're trapped. And that's the real crisis.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so in a way, they long for death.
Yes, it's true. Yeah. It's that terrifying idea of being just stuck. Isn't it? Forever.
Stunted.
Yeah, which is why I think you often get that in zombie movies, that if one of your friends turned, there's that scene where it's emotional and you have to put them down, And it's like a bit like, it's the kind of thing, it's just to kind of actually give you proper death, proper peace, rather than this kind of liminal.
It becomes an act of compassion.
Absolutely. Yeah,
definitely. And I want to ask you a bit about the idea of, this is something we touched upon a little bit, Mary, with slashers and kind of the popularity of slashers, I suppose. There's probably a link because of the gore, but what is it about what is it that's so fun about watching a movie like Brain Dead and seeing somebody with a lawnmower absolutely, tear humans or what used to be humans into shreds? I mean, there's something, very kind of weirdly satisfying about the kind of tangibility or something of these zombies, and watching, eyes getting gouged out, guts getting ripped out, heads being lopped off, and all that kind of thing. What is it about that makes those films so appealing, do you think?
I think it actually appeals to this maybe, I don't know, an impulse, a compulsion within our unconscious that's tied to the idea of the Freudian id.
Yes, yeah.
This idea that, Freud actually talked about the id as being this disorganized part of ourselves that contains our most basic states, the instinctual drives, basically. And the id is present with us, at birth. So it's what we're born with. It's the source of our bodily needs, wants, desires, impulses, particularly sexual and aggressive drives.
Yes. It's kind of like your kind of base animal sort of urges or something, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the id acts according to, the pleasure principle, the psychic force that motivates the tendency to seek immediate gratification of any impulse, and is defined as seeking to avoid pain arised by increases in instinctual tension. So it doesn't want to be confronted with a reality principle. It doesn't want to know that, something's not possible. It just wants to do it. And so in a sense, this actually makes me think of, I think the answer here lies in actually it's David Cronenberg's film Shivers.
I was just about to bring that up. Yeah.
Because there's a character in there that talks about, he says, man is an animal that thinks too much an over-rational animal who has lost touch with his body and his instincts. Too much brain, not enough guts.
Yes.
This parasite is a combination. Well, he's talking about the parasite that's like invading people's bodies and turning them into
horrible
zombies.
sort of penis-shaped monster. Yeah.
I mean, that's so unlike Cronenberg, right?
I know. Brilliant.
He said it's a combination of an aphrodisiac and a sexually transmitted disease that will hopefully turn the whole world into one beautiful, mindless orgy. So what he's saying is that the kind of whole raison d'etre for this zombie entity is to provide a platform for all of those id desires to be fulfilled.
Roger, I had a very disturbing dream last night. I found myself making love to a strange man. But then he tells me that everything is erotic. He tells me that even old flesh is erotic flesh. That disease is the love of two alien kinds of creatures for each other. That even dying is an act of eroticism. And I believe him. And we make love beautifully.
Yes.
And so on some level, as viewers, we watch zombie movies and we kind of live through kind of virtually in a second-hand way the realization and the manifestation of all those id impulses.
Yes.
We're kind of vicariously living out those illicit desires in this safe space, which is the zombie, lexicon.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the same kind of thing, Tim, isn't it? From a kind of I guess it's like watching what would happen in the breakdown of society and what would we do, and kind of cathartically living it out, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I found this really interesting quote from Wes Craven, and he was talking, I think, about his movie Last House on the Left, which came out, I think, 4 years after Night. But I think, as with a lot of those grindhouse movies of that period, you could apply it, to different titles. And what Craven essentially said was this. He said, gore stood for everything that was hidden in society. Guts stood for issues that were being repressed. So the sight of a body being eviscerated was exhilarating to the audience because they felt, thank God, it's finally out in the open and slopping around on the floor. And I find, for me, that really connected, because I'm like, we live in like an age, and I think same then really, where media kind of highly can sanitize certain things. So we have, again, like the idea of being post-truth,
Instagram filters,
exactly. I mean, and that period, it was about the media sanitizing Vietnam as a event. Nowadays, and it's not to get too political, but we do have a president who talks about alternative facts, for instance. And I think what Craven's there saying is there's something deeply cathartic about you rip it to shreds and it put it all out there, and then the body's being destroyed is a representation of it. Now, I'm not saying you apply it to all things. I think Brain Dead, I know there's like Mary and I were kind of, I think, chatting on Facebook and saying there are Freudian elements to that, but also it's just a lot of fun, isn't it? It's like kind of the visceral thrill of just seeing a lot of splattery gore, and same with slashers. But in some of the other movies, I would say, for instance, again, there's a moment in Day of the Dead, don't want to say too much because I know you're going to cover it in detail, but where a particular character is torn in half, and there is something cathartic about it because about what it represents. In terms of
that character deserves it as well. that helps.
He deserves it, but because he kind of represents a particular ideological standpoint, which is then destroyed.
So true.
And so there's that element to it.
It's really interesting. You're totally right. Actually, Tim, I want to ask you as well, just rewinding back in time slightly. I touched on this very briefly with Kevin, this kind of... Is there a connection? When I was looking at Shivers, for example, I was like, it's not technically a zombie film. In fact, you could almost liken it to the kind of invasion of the body snatchers type narrative. Yeah, it's more like these kind of parasites getting in. But I think, like you said, Mary, it's the id. The differences, I think, is that kind of id nature of the infected is much more zombie-like than, I guess, with the kind of body snatchers. It's almost like the superego. It's almost the opposite, isn't it? They become this like very, what would you call them? Like a very kind of mannered, robotic kind of polite society, brainwashed kind of. And I guess that's the difference, isn't it? Because again,
they're
it's
programmed.
Like yes, exactly. Whereas Shivers goes the opposite way, even though it in some ways narratively could be likened more to those kind of movies, couldn't it?
And again, I think it's a fascinating point that you see Night of the Living Dead being made in the 60s as it was, because you've got like decades of the Red Threat, the Red Scare of fear of communism, and communists were represented in America as being these kind of en masse, almost robotic automatons that were coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming into the American home, and that sense of you lose your individuality, you become part of a hive mind. One more thing I would say, rewinding even further though, like into the 50s, something I kind of came across in reading around the topic was from the Korean War, where America went into South Korea to try and stop the communist North, supported by China, invading the South. And apparently the Chinese army came in, they were under equipped with their weapons, but they had this tactic called the human wave, where they would essentially send in wave after wave of their own people with not enough guns to go around, and they would be mowed down by the Americans on the machine gun. And the idea that pure numbers would overwhelm them eventually, now that becomes the kind of zombie as mass. So pre-68, all the zombies are one or two. They're not really interested in eating people or even hurting people particularly. And then 68 onwards, zombies as mass coming in wave after wave, and that goes all the way through to finding its apex probably in like something like World War Z, where you've got literally a wave crashing over the walls of Jerusalem in that scene. Definitely. And so I think if you wanted to take a zombies as fear of communism / communal mass, because we're not, I don't have the same anxieties about communism that America did back in that period, but perhaps that same fear of being overwhelmed by a huge crowd of other,
Definitely. Anything else you guys want to Mary, are there any other particular kind of favourites or texts or interesting movies in the zombie subgenre that we haven't covered that you want to give a mention to?
I really probably just Brain Dead.
Yes, amazing.
Yeah, I just really want to spend some time just to kind of, not to go too much into it, but in terms of psychoanalytically, I do also love Pet Sematary as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, just because it's that whole thing about the return of the repressed and this guy who's caught up in a family crisis, and he's facing loss, and he kind of longs to bring back what he's lost. So it's another dimension that, another example of the element of depression being manifested in film.
Definitely. It's definitely about grief, that film, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I find it one of the most troubling and scary zombie movies, to be honest, of all of them. Just the idea of it, the story, this father and this child, and it's really horrific, isn't it?
I think you talk about it in the same breath as something like The Babadook as a film about grief coming back and then finding a way to process it, although it goes very differently for the guys in Pet Sematary.
But also maybe even on an abstract level, like the loss of innocence and children being affected as well. And then this kind of longing to bring back innocence, but can never really come back as it once was. It'll be distorted. It'll be something else.
Yes.
But mainly Brain Dead is a real favorite of mine. It's also known as Dead Alive.
Yes, it is. That's right. The US title's Dead Alive.
Directed by Peter Jackson, 1992 release. It's a Kiwi film.
My husband's
brilliant. Kiwi.
Kiwi, I tell you what, Kiwis do horror very well.
They do.
And they do kind of comedy horror very well, don't they? Yeah.
It's a very almost subgenre unto itself, isn't it?
Yes, right.
Absolutely.
Fantastic, yeah.
Custard! I haven't had a good custard in years. She never makes the stuff. Damn fine custard. Rich and creamy, just the way I like it.
There's so much about it I love. The main reason I'm sort of drawn to it because it's a real kind of zombie retelling of an Oedipal crisis.
Yes.
Where there's the Freudian theme of the overbearing mother who micromanages the son's every move, and he then in turn becomes a neurotic. And he exists purely on her terms and never fully enjoying his own life. He's like her carer. He's unable to claim his autonomy and pursue romantic relationships. And the gory tale of the mother as a terrifying zombie who just won't die really reflects the son's undead state,
right?
Of kind of remaining under her control, living in this purgatorial state, never really launching into life. And he's prevented from following his desires and living his life. So this to me it's kind of pinning those two zombie states against each other. You know, the real kind of the typical tropes that we see in the film that indicate what a zombie is, but also his psychological, like, zombified state.
Yes.
I really love that.
And it's still, I think, thought of as one of the most grotesque horror movies ever, isn't it? And it's not just the splattery gore, but moments like the kind of dinner table phlegm. It's that real kind of all the most grotesque things you could have. Proper abject stuff, isn't it?
I feel like I kind of blame Mary, because I kind of I watched it for the first time a couple of weeks ago, because I thought I'm going to watch it ahead of coming to chat with you guys, and I've got a fairly strong stomach. I felt sick like 4 times while watching that movie, and it was like the custard scene. It was like, you know, and you just think,
it's the little details.
Yeah.
It really is. It's gross, isn't
gross.
it? It's gross. It's brilliantly gross. Yeah, almost. I find that scene more unbearable than, you know, slicing up with lawnmowers and that. You know, it's
Evil Dead, fine, or like with the chainsaws and stuff, and then
well, it's those little moments, isn't it? And we've talked about this loads on this podcast, but, you know, the idea that watching somebody, you know, I don't know, stub their finger is somehow more painful to watch.
Yes.
It's like Black Swan and those types
I was going to say a hangnail.
Yes, exactly. More than getting your head lopped off or something, isn't it? It's that kind of, and the Evil Dead, the moment that I hate is when the pencil gets jammed into the ankle and you see it kind of, you know, that to me is so much more horrible than when, you know, the fountains of blood and eye gouging that comes later. It's interesting, isn't it? Why is that? Is it just because it's more relatable to us, Mary?
I think so. And I think it's just, I think it's more relatable. We in a sense, there's suspension of disbelief because we feel we could be in that position, experiencing that very moment.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not so outlandish and so like disconnected from us.
And I guess that's why, like, going back to what we said at the beginning, it's that there's something kind of just sort of brainless and fun, you know, about zombies as well, in that, you know, it is over the top gore. Brain Dead is the perfect, you know, example, isn't it, of like, this is so ridiculous that it is, you're laughing and you're having such a fun time watching it. That's the thing.
And I think talks interestingly about the breadth of the subgenre, because you can have something which is very existential and very deep and meaty in terms of its messages, and something which is less so. So, I mean, I'm not sure what deeper meaning I personally bring out of Evil Dead 2, but I love that film. You know, it's so fun. You know,
I think there are definitely the two types of zombie films, aren't there? Because, you know, Fulci and Raimi, those movies, I'm not sure how much you'd want to take from them or read into them. Sometimes I think they don't warrant it.
You read like interviews with Fulci, and he like actively rejects things like narrative logic. He's like, I don't care. I'm just trying to put like a series of images together to make pure cinema.
Exactly.
You know.
Good for him.
Yeah, absolutely. But
so what do you think then? Actually, Tim, I was going to ask you. So I've already asked Mary, but what are there any other kind of particular zombie movies that stand out for you, or any other ones you want to mention? Any favourites?
So we touched on it briefly. I would just briefly touch on World War Z. Yes. I don't think it's a great film. I'm really fascinated to see what Fincher does with the sequel. But for me, the idea of zombies as swarm or horde probably reaches its apex in that film. And I think, for me, the bit that connects, maybe it's just because my day job is working with asylum seekers, is the idea of others represented in dehumanized language as a swarm. So like a few years ago, we had David Cameron talking about the European migration crisis and said we have a swarm of people, you know, coming across France. And for me, and the scene in World War Z, which I was thinking of in particular, was the walls of Jerusalem being breached. And so you have this sense of presumably Arab zombies coming into in Jerusalem, and you don't have to go too far to kind of see that's quite right wing, right? You know, this kind of idea of protectionism, isolationism, and othering people of other nationalities, which is so current. You know, we've got like, you know, Brexit, we've got the wall supposedly trying to be built across the US-Mexican border. And for me, that's, again, not a great film, not a great adaptation of a book, but
a really interesting idea.
So
what made that film that much more disappointing in a way? But have you read the book?
I have read the book.
It's a brilliant book, I think. It's so different to the film. It's that really interesting kind of real life, this is how different nations would treat this apocalypse happening. Is fascinating. And it is really fascinating.
I mean, the other film I'd give a shout out to, not necessarily for a sociological perspective, but just because I really love it, is Mark Price's Colin, which is like this really small little British film.
Seen it.
Okay, so it was made for like reportedly about 45 quid, and it looks like it. To be fair. It was shot like a handy cam, edited on like a creaking old home computer. But the thing that stands out for me is it was shot from the perspective of a zombie called Colin, and it's about how he shuffles through an apocalyptic London, and the film gradually reveals what it is that's driving him, and it's this kind of ghost. It goes back to the kind of the Dawn of the Dead idea that the reason they go to the mall is there's something still in them which draws them there, and you kind of gradually reveal what is driving Colin. And the reason I love it, I mean, if you love indie filmmaking, it's a great success story, but also it achieves a level of emotional resonance which loads of other films with, you know, budgets hundreds of times that which Mark Price used doesn't achieve. And it's for me that's probably the best example of the emotional impact of a zombie movie versus like the kind of sociological metaphors.
Amazing. What do you think then is the sort of future of zombie movies? I mean, I think that there's a risk that we are maybe getting a bit of zombie fatigue recently. Maybe it's just my own opinion, but like, you know, The Walking Dead and a lot of recent zombie movies, there have been some really good ones, some really solid ones like Train to Busan and movies like that. And The Girl with All the Gifts is really interesting, but it didn't maybe cause as big a wave as maybe it should have. But, you know, I feel like maybe, you know, we need another 28 Days Later, or we need another something to push it along or do something new with it. I mean, what do you think? Or do you still think there's lots of life in the zombie movies? Mary, what do you think, first of all?
I mean, I know there's been a lot of self-parody and stuff.
Yes.
And, you know, one might think, is this, as you say, there's zombie fatigue. I, for one, don't think that the subgenre is in trouble. Firstly, I'd like to say that I think self-parody is actually quite a healthy mechanism, you know, by which a subgenre can reassess itself, evolve into its next form, kind of shedding of cinematic skin to emerge radically transformed.
Yes.
And I think in terms of the future, what I'd like to see, and I think there probably is scope for this, I think the future of the zombie movies is maybe techno-horror.
Yes.
The chronicling of dogpiling behavior on social media and depicting the kind of follower herd mentality on platforms like Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram.
Definitely.
And where we see that kind of mindless following, brainless, behavior, really kind of unthinking sort of conduct where people are not checking sources when they report something. They're just following a trend. You know, and literally following a hashtag trend, you know? And I just think that there's potentially a lot that can be done with that. And we've already seen a lot of these kind of techno horror films like Cam and Searching and Unfriended.
Totally. Yeah.
And I like to see there's, you know, more zombie tropes maybe emerging in those.
Yeah, well, actually, funnily enough, like we went to see together recently, didn't we? Assassination Nation.
Yeah.
Although it's not a zombie film, there is that idea of technology and society breaking down because of it, and people basically becoming their kind of base id selves due to these untruths and
like half-baked ideas
yes.
or really dodgy ideologies, or maybe even just moral panics.
Yes, exactly.
Where they're completely sort of like whipped up into a frenzy, but maybe by media outlets who maybe stand to profit from that kind of moral panic as well.
Yeah.
And then it just spreads and it infects people's minds, and people think because they've seen it on the internet, it has some legitimacy, and it doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, Tim, like, it will take a few years to realize it, but surely we're living in the most perfect time right now for this kind of subgenre in a way, you know, just like 1968 or whenever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I would say the social circumstances are ripe, you know, and maybe that's why people are still really connecting with it, right?
Yes.
I would say there's a lot of mediocre films out there, because it's kind of the way that if a genre or a subgenre is popular, it gets flooded with a lot of stuff which isn't maybe particularly well done.
And zombie films are cheap to make, they're easy to make, and therefore you get a lot of them, and they're not always great, you know.
That's it, but it's no reason to write it off, because I think since 68 consistently they've spoken to different concerns, different issues, and because the zombie is so flexible and so reflective, as we've already said, I think, you know, I can't see it going anywhere anytime soon. And so I think it just requires somebody with a particular vision. I mean, I think somebody should probably give Mary a budget. That sounds amazing.
Yes, definitely.
I'd watch that.
Definitely. I mean, I could see there'll be a Black Mirror episode along those lines at some point, weren't they? You know, they've already almost, you know, gone there at times.
Because you've got like Dead Set as a mini-series.
Dead Set, of course, we haven't touched on that.
And Pontypool, those are like texts which draw a little bit on the relationship with technology and the zombie phenomenon, not like the social media dimension per se, but like, you know, the idea of television and radio. And so, yeah, certainly because, you know, technology's moved on since both of those films were made. I think it'd be cool to see something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, Dead Set is touching on like celebrity culture and the kind of zombified state of super fans, and maybe they may not even be real fans. They're just sort of bonding together in a massive crowd and a massive group of people, idolizing maybe people they barely know anything about at all.
Yes.
And so that's quite scary. And then so that's why I love Dead Set, because it really brings that point across.
All right, guys. Well, before we finish, we've probably already spoken about them, but I've got to ask you, what is your favourite zombie film?
So I'm going to say Colin.
Are you? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I just, you know, because it affected me emotionally more than probably any other zombie film. And yes, you know, there are lots which are slicker. And so if we're going to talk canon, I'd probably say, probably Day of the Dead. But Colin, for me, has got like an emotional kick, which even Romero doesn't quite achieve. So I'll fly the flag for that one.
Yeah. Mary, what about you?
I have to say Brain Dead.
Yeah.
But also honorable mention to Cronenberg's Rabid. Do you guys say Rabid or Rabid?
You know,
I'm flexible.
I say Rabid, but I'm always wondering if I'm right or wrong by saying Rabid. Yeah, I think you can say Rabid. I think.
Yeah. I love it. I love Rabid. I think it's fantastic, and it's great that he cast Marilyn Chambers in it, who was, you know, had been a pornographic performer, and she just brought so much to it. It's just such a fascinating film, and a lot of it is shot in Montreal, which is where I'm from.
Oh wow! Yeah. Oh cool. I mean, Cronenberg is just the master, isn't he? And even though his films, whether or not you call them traditional zombie films, but they're just so brilliant, and they're so packed with all of these themes that we've been discussing, aren't they? That's the thing.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's obsessed with psychoanalysis, of course, because he directed Dangerous Method.
Yes.
But what I love about him is that he's such an innovator, and so when he touches this kind of subgenre, he brings he puts his own mark on it.
Yeah. Amazing. Tim, as you're a newcomer to this podcast, I have to ask you as well. I ask everyone for the first time on this, what's your favourite horror film?
So I'm going to do the now time-honoured tradition of giving you the 5, I guess, you know, for the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know that, this season it's going to be 5, next season it'll be 10.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Go on.
So it would be for me Bill Blatty's The Exorcist, John Carpenter's The Thing, Takashi Miike's Edition, Pascal Augier's Martyrs, and Toby Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I think for me that kind of represents like a lot of the stuff I love about horror, from the body horror through to the more extreme stuff. Like the kind of the sociological dimensions, so like stuff like Audition and Martyrs in particular deal with violence in a way that is extreme, but it's also incredibly loaded, rich in meaning, and deeply cathartic. And I think particularly we're in the age of like Me Too and really confronting like gendered violence as a society in like open dialogue. I think films like that have got so much to talk about in that context. So yeah.
Cannot argue with those 5 picks at all.
Great
really
picks.
Amazing. All quite extreme. You're a hardcore horror fan.
Well, I think it is. I mean, like, yeah, it's like Craven quite right. I prefer stuff which doesn't hide away and we just say, it's extreme, but it's meaningful as well. And so it's not pointlessness, gratuitousness. It's tackling some deep and important ideas, and that's why I kind of connect with that.
Which makes them all the more harrowing, those films.
Exactly.
Those are films that are like, how many times can I watch Martyrs or Texas Chainsaw or Audition? I can, because I love it, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually argue that Martyrs is a very optimistic film, but that's probably for another time.
We'll get to that another time at some point on this podcast. Amazing. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. This has been so much fun. Mary, if people want to sort of find you and find your podcast and that kind of thing, where can they find you?
Well, the best place is to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Psychstar. That's PSYCSTAR. And you can find Projections Podcast on iTunes.
Amazing. Tim, what about you? Where can people find you online?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Fats Coleman, which is FATSCOLEMAN. Or you can read stuff that I've written in Total Film most months. And I'm on Letterboxd as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
And there we have it. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to my 3 incredible guests, Kevin Lyons, Tim Coleman, and of course, Mary Wilde. So, what do you guys think of the zombie subgenre? How excited are you to go on this journey with me over the next 20 weeks? Are you as in love with the zombie subgenre as so many other people out there? Or do you think it's a little bit overrated? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can also find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. And if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to us on Letterboxd. That's where you're going to find out exactly what movies we're going to be covering in depth from week to week on the podcast. So you can keep up to date with what we're going to be covering. You can make yourself a little list of what movies to watch and check out the films in advance of the discussions. There is also a discussion group, the brilliant Evolution of Horror discussion group, filled with wonderful people, a brilliant community of horror fans. That's where you can come and chat about horror, about the podcast, about anything you like with fellow listeners. And don't forget, there is a whole catalogue of other episodes still available. There's a whole series on slashers, on ghost stories, on folk horror, and a whole load of other bonus content. All of that can be found on our website. That's evolutionofhorror.com. So next week we begin our in-depth zombie reviews. I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest. Filmmaker and writer Axel Carolyn will be here all the way from LA, and she will be joining me to discuss two of the original zombie movies, White Zombie from 1932 starring Bela Lugosi, and Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur's I Walked with a Zombie from 1943. I think they're both available to stream for free on places like YouTube. I think you can also find them on Amazon Prime, so they should be easy enough to view, and they're both very short, only about 65 minutes long, so please do give them a watch before next week if you get a chance. Join us then for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.